I died the way I lived, on the clock. 11:40 at night, briefcase in one hand, phone in the other, 41 hours awake across 3 days because the quarterly report wouldn't file itself. Sato Kenta, 27, associate at a logistics firm that would replace me before my desk got cold. I stepped off the curb because the light said walk, and somewhere in the dark, a delivery driver who had also not slept in 3 days let his eyes fall shut. I didn't even hear the truck. That's the thing nobody tells you. There was no screech, no slow motion, no flash of my whole life. There was the crosswalk, and then there was nothing, and in the nothing there was one clear thought, warm and stupid and my own. I want to go back to the village. Not the apartment, not the office. The village where my grandmother lived, where I spent 3 summers as a kid before my parents decided cram school was more important than clean air. Rice terraces. Cold well water, a cat that slept on the Ngawa. Nobody in a hurry. I'd wanted to move back there for 15 years, and I'd never once done it, because there was always one more report. That thought was the last thing that was mine before the white. The white had a person in it, not a booming voice from the heavens. A person youngish, harried, sitting at what looked like a customer service desk that stretched off in every direction into the glow, with a stack of glowing tablets teetering beside him. He had the specific tired look of a man 3 tickets behind and knew it. "Ah," he said and winced. Okay, hello. Sato Kenta. Right, so." He pinched the bridge of his nose. This is going to sound bad. I looked down at myself. I was standing. I had hands. I had no truck-shaped opinions about my hands, which was already an improvement. "Am I dead?" I said. "Very, extremely, instantly if it helps." He shuffled a tablet. "So here's the thing, and I want to be upfront because we've had complaints. There was a routing error. On our end. Your soul was flagged for the standard cycle new life, memory wipe, back into the pool, but the flag got attached to the wrong queue. You were held, in transit. For, he checked, for about 6 of your world's hours. Which is nothing to us, but it means your consciousness stayed intact long enough that I can't legally just wipe you and drop you back in. Continuity of self. There's a form." I stared at him. The exhaustion of 41 waking hours was gone. My back didn't hurt. I felt, for the first time in years, rested, and I was hearing about a clerical error in the afterlife. "So this is a customer service thing," I said. "This is a customer service thing," he agreed, with real relief that I'd understood. "And because it's our fault, you get compensation, custom terms, which look, most people in your seat go straight for it. Combat, cheat, harem, dragon that lives in their soul, the whole package, we keep the templates on file." He waved at the stack of tablets. "I can do you the whole hero deal. Reincarnate into a world with monsters and magic, give you a stat sheet, off you go to save a kingdom. And here's the part I'm not proud of, and also the part I'd do again 1,000 times. I thought about the report. I thought about 41 hours. I thought about every weekend I gave to a company that spelled my name wrong on my leaving card, which I never got because I left under a truck. I thought about the one clear warm thought I'd had at the exact instant of death. "No," I said. The clerk's stylus stopped. "No? I don't want to save a kingdom." I could hear how strange it sounded. I didn't care. "I want a village, a small one. Warm in winter, cool in summer, good food, enough money that nobody has to work themselves to death. And I want to be nobody. Comfortable and nobody. That's the compensation. Can you do that?" He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his tired face shifted, and for just a second he didn't look like a clerk 3 tickets behind. He looked like someone who processed 10,000 power fantasies a day and had just been handed something he could actually respect. "You'd be amazed," he said quietly, "how rarely I hear that." He tapped the tablet a few times. "Okay. I can't do your world. That's a closed system. You're out. But I've got an open destination that fits the profile. Rural fantasy world. Low magic. Low danger in the settled regions. Farming realm called Midfield. There's a family minor nobility, a barony, but the small kind. Cottage and a village and some fields. Retired warrior father, decent man, 3 kids worth of slots. Second son opening." He glanced up. "Second son's good for you. First son inherits the headaches. Second son gets to just exist." "Exist," I repeated. It sounded like heaven. It sounded like the village. "There's a catch and it's a good one, so hear me out." He held up a hand. "I have to give you something, procedurally. Compensation regs. Can't send you in blank, it flags an audit. So I'm going to give you 2 low-key gifts. 1. Spatial magic. Teleportation. Small scale to start. It's rare in that world, but it's not a war winner. It's a convenience. Move things without carrying them. You'll love it. You're a logistics guy. He almost smiled. 2. Fast learning. You pick up any magic you're exposed to faster than a normal person. Again, not a cheat, a quality of life thing. You want a comfortable life? Comfort is a skill. Neither of those is a sword, I said. Neither of those is a sword, he confirmed. That's the point. You said nobody. These keep you nobody with good storage and a shorter learning curve. The magic starts near zero. By the way, infants have almost no capacity. You'll have to grow it slow. Nothing comes free. Even the mercy has to be earned a little. He hovered the stylus over a final glowing panel. Do you accept the terms of compensation, Sato Kenta? Yeah, I said. Yes. Send me somewhere quiet. Sending you somewhere quiet, he echoed and pressed down. Then, as the white started to fold up around the edges like a photo curling in a fire, he added, faster, almost apologetic, for what it's worth, I really am sorry about the truck. And Kenta? Quiet's harder to keep than people think? I wanted to ask what that meant. I didn't get the chance. The first thing about being a baby is that you are furious about the temperature. That's the honest truth nobody warns you about. There's no gentle awakening, no soft dawn of new life. There is cold, sudden and total, and lungs that don't know they're lungs, and light so bright it's an assault, and hands the size of a large adult's holding you upside down, and every single instinct in a body that has been alive for 4 minutes screaming scream. So I screamed. It turns out you don't have a choice. And through the screaming, through the blur, I heard a voice, a man's voice, low and rough, and cracked with something that took me a second to recognize as pure joy. A boy, the voice said. Look at the lungs on him. Gods, listen to that. Strong, he's strong. My vision was garbage, all smears and halos, but I could make out the shape holding me, enormous. A slab of a man, shoulders like a doorframe, a beard going gray, and one eye crinkled nearly shut with a grin so wide it reorganized his whole scarred face. He held me like I was made of soap bubbles, this mountain of a man, terrified of his own strength. Goro Midorikawa, my father. Though I didn't have the name yet. I just had the eye, and the grin, and the way he angled his body to shield me from the draft without seeming to think about it. And I thought, through the animal panic of a newborn's brain, oh, this one's kind. I got a kind one. Let me see him, you great ox. A woman's voice, exhausted and radiant. My mother. She had been sick already for a while, though I wouldn't learn that until later, and she would faded from the daily bustle of the house early into my childhood more warmth than person to a mind that started as a screaming infant and gone quiet when I was 5. But that first day her hands were the softest thing that had ever touched me, and I stopped screaming when she took me. Just stopped, mid-wail, because some part of the wet new animal I now was recognized safe. 2 more shapes crowded the edge of the bed. One was a girl, maybe 5, vibrating with the specific energy of a child who has been told to be gentle and is failing. Is that it? Is that the baby? He's so small. Why is he purple? Mama, can he fight? When can he fight? That was Yuna, my sister. She would spend the next several years profoundly unimpressed by me, and I would come to treasure that more than I can say. The other shape hung back, quiet, a boy of 7 or 8 with a serious face, watching me not with a 5-year-old's greed for a new toy but with a strange, careful attention, like he was reading something. When my smeared vision drifted his way, I could have sworn a newborn. I know, but I could have sworn our eyes met, and his narrowed just slightly, thoughtful. Tetsuo, my brother. The first person in this new world to notice something was odd about me, and it would turn out the first to decide it didn't matter. Behind them, in the doorway, 2 more, a young woman in a maid's apron pressing her hands to her mouth, tears already going, and an old man leaning on the frame with the bearing of a soldier and the face of someone deeply amused by soft things he pretended not to care about. Momo and Dantaro, my whole world, gathered in one warm fire-lit room that smelled of wood smoke and clean linen and, faintly, of rice. Rice. Lying there, half-blind and brand new, I did a thing you're not supposed to be able to do at 4 minutes old. I catalogued. Old habit. Old habit, from a life spent building models of systems in my head. I logged, warm room, fire, so fuel isn't scarce, clean cloth, so not desperate poor, well-fed people, the big man's got weight on his frame beyond muscle, they eat. A maid and a manservant, so minor gentry, not laborers. A kind father, a brother who watches, a sister who wants to fight the furniture. And I thought, with a relief so total it nearly put me back to sleep on the spot, he did it. The clerk actually did it. This is the village. Not my grandmother's village, not Japan, not even clothes. The words they spoke weren't Japanese, and somehow I understood them anyway, the clerk's fine print quietly at work. But the shape of the thing, small, warm, enough, people who looked at a screaming purple newborn and saw treasure. I made a decision then. In the crib they laid me in that night, wrapped so tight I could barely twitch, listening to my new family murmur in the next room over the good news of a healthy second son. Nobody, I decided. I stay nobody. I keep my head down. I grow up quiet. I eat good food. I nap in the sun. And I let this family have its ordinary happy life without a single strange thing coming to their door because of me. I had a whole life of being the guy who fixed everything and it killed me. Not this time. This time I'm just Rito. The lazy one. The forgettable one. The comfortable one. I was going to be so good at doing nothing, except there was a pebble. They'd left it in the crib not on purpose, a stone the size of a bean, probably tracked in on someone's boot and swept absently into the blankets. It sat by my left hand in the dark, and I couldn't sleep, because a 4-minute-old brain full of a 27-year-old's insomnia does not simply power down on command. And I had this gift, 2 of them. I hadn't tried either. The clerk said spatial, teleportation, move things without carrying them. I lay there in the dark, this useless soft new body, and I thought, just once. Just to know it's real. Then I sleep, and I never make it interesting, I swear. I looked at the pebble. I reached for the sense of it, and it was there, immediate and strange, a knowing of where the pebble was in space that I'd never had a word for in my old life because my old life didn't have the sense to hang the word on. I found the far corner of the crib, past my feet, and I thought the pebble there. It went. No flash, no sound. The pebble was by my hand, and then the pebble was in the far corner, and the space between hadn't been crossed so much as skipped. My scalp prickled. My heart, my tiny hammering new heart jumped, and then the world grayed at the edges. It hit like a plug pulled. Every bit of warmth and alertness drained out of me in a rush, faster than any tiredness I'd ever felt, faster than 41 hours awake, a bone-deep empty that came out of nowhere the instant the pebble landed. Mana, I thought dimly, going under. That's what empty mana feels like. One pebble, one bean-sized pebble, crossed 30 centimeters and it took every drop I have. The clerk wasn't kidding. Near zero. I couldn't even be alarmed properly. The body was already shutting down, dragging me towards sleep with the totality of a machine that had blown a fuse. My last thought, sliding into the dark of my very first night in the village I'd died wishing for, wasn't fear. It was the old habit. The catalog. The engineer, waking up in a new machine, and despite every promise I'd just made to be nobody, unable to stop measuring. One teleport, I thought, drains the whole reserve. Reserve refills during sleep. And a body this young, this fast-growing, it should refill a little bigger than before. Muscles do that. Why not this? Empty it. Sleep. Wake up stronger. Empty it again. I was asleep before I could tell myself to stop. But the plan was already there, drawn clean in the dark behind my eyes, complete before I even understood it was a plan. The first entry in a ledger I would keep for the rest of my second life, whether I wanted to or not. So much for nobody. Here is the problem with being a genius trapped in the body of a 6-month-old. You can design the perfect training regimen, and then you have to execute it with hands that can't reliably find your own mouth. Let me explain the method, because the method is everything. Day 1. Well, functional day 1, months after the pebble, I had a working theory. Teleporting drains my mana to 0. Sleep refills it. And a growing body, pushed to its limit and then allowed to recover, comes back slightly stronger than before. Progressive overload. Every gym rat in my old world lived by it without knowing the words. Empty the tank, rest, the tank grows. I'd done it with muscle. I was betting the same rule governed mana in this world, because in my experience the universe is lazy and reuses good ideas. So, the regimen. Object 1, a pebble, same class as the first. I'd smuggled 3 of them into the crib over a period of weeks, one at a time, in the folds of my swaddling, because acquiring pebbles when you cannot walk is a genuine logistical challenge that I will not bore you with, except to say it involved a lot of patient, humiliating grabbing. I teleport the pebble across the crib. The gray comes down. I sleep. I wake. And the very first thing I do, before the milk, before anything, is teleport that pebble again and count. Count what? Count how far the empty is. In the beginning, 1 pebble across 30 centimeters put me straight into the dark. But by what I judged to be my 8th or 9th month, I was keeping a rough calendar off the light through the shutters and the rhythm of the household. 1 pebble no longer emptied me. There was a sliver left after. a margin. I could teleport a pebble, feel around inside myself, and find that the plug hadn't quite pulled, so I teleported the second pebble. That pulled it. I logged it. Not on paper, I had no paper, no way to hold a stylus, no way to explain why a baby wanted one. I logged it in my head, the way I'd once held 6 spreadsheets in memory during a meeting because opening the laptop looked lazy. 2 pebbles to empty, month 9. That was data. That was progress you could put a number on. You have no idea how much that number meant to me. In my old life, progress was a lie. You worked 100 hours, and the number that mattered, the promotion, the raise, the rest never moved because it was never going to. Here, in a crib, in the dark, I did the work, and the number moved. 2 pebbles. It would be 3. I would make it 3 if it killed me, and given my method, it very nearly could. The method had a flaw, and the flaw was that it looked exactly like a baby collapsing, because that's what it was. I'd teleport my pebbles, drain to 0, and go out like a snuffed candle mid-afternoon, mid-morning, whenever I could engineer privacy. To a family, an infant who abruptly, deeply, unwakeably passes out several times a day is not training. It is, call for the healer, something is wrong with the baby. So I built cover. I made myself a champion napper. I established, through relentless consistency, that Rado, the second son, simply slept like the dead at odd hours, that this was his character, the lazy one, the sleepy one, exactly the forgettable child I'd promised myself I'd be. I timed my drains to the household rhythm. After feeding, when a full baby dropping off is normal, in the drowsy dead of afternoon, whenever Momo, who checked on me most, had just been by and wouldn't return for an hour. It worked mostly because I made it boring. Nothing hides like boredom. A baby who sleeps a lot is the least interesting thing in a house full of a warrior father, a sword-mad sister, and a scholarly brother. I banked on being overlooked, and I paid for that safety with genuine, marrow-deep exhaustion several times a day, over and over, for months. It was, I want to be clear, miserable. I had signed up for comfort, for naps in the sun and good food. And instead, I was voluntarily blowing my own fuse 3 times a day and lying in the dark waiting to recover so I could do it again, driven by an engineer's brain that had never in 2 lifetimes known how to leave a growth curve alone. The clerk had warned me, quiet's harder to keep than people think. He'd meant the world. He hadn't mentioned that the hardest part of keeping quiet would be me. The spoon nearly ended it. I'd graduated cautiously, from pebbles to a spoon. Bigger object, more mass, better data, and more risk. Because a spoon is a thing people notice moving. It happened on an afternoon I'd misjudged. Momo had come by earlier than her pattern. I hadn't heard her over my own concentration, and I had a tin spoon pilfered from a tray, my newest test mass hanging in the air above my crib, mid-teleport, when the door opened. Not Momo, Yuna. My sister, 6 now, all elbows and ambition, had wandered in looking for someone to spar with, and found instead the family baby lying flat on his back, staring at a spoon that was floating a hand's width over his face. For 1 full second, neither of us moved. The spoon hung there. I could feel my reserve nearly spent, the drain a breath away. Yuna's eyes went round. Her mouth opened. I did the only thing available to a 9-month-old caught red-handed committing magic. I let go, badly. The spoon dropped and clocked me right on the forehead. I did not have to fake the resulting outrage. I howled genuine, wet, undignified infant fury, the spoon clattering off my chest, and I made it as loud and as stupid as I possibly could because stupid is safe, stupid is boring, stupid is a baby who got hit by a spoon he was somehow waving around. Rito. Oh no, did you throw it? Did you throw the spoon at your own face? Yuna was torn between alarm and the dawning delight of a child who has witnessed something idiotic. You did, didn't you? You little how did it even get up there? She reached for it. She turned it over. I saw the exact moment the actual question, how did a baby who can't sit up unsupported get a spoon into the air, began to form behind her 6-year-old eyes. The door opened again. What's all the noise, Tetsuo? My brother, 10 now, book in hand, taking in the scene. Bawling baby, red mark on forehead, sister holding a spoon and frowning at it like it had insulted her. And Tetsuo, quiet, watchful Tetsuo, who had looked at me on the first night with those narrowed, reading eyes. Tetsuo took it all in, and I watched him decide something. He knocked the tray, Tetsuo said calmly before Yuna could speak. It's on its side, look. Spoon must have flipped up when it fell and come down on him. He crossed the room, righted the tray I had absolutely not touched, and picked up the spoon from Yuna's hand. Poor thing. That's a nasty little mark. Momo, he called toward the hall. Rado bumped his head. Can you bring a cool cloth? The tray had not fallen. We both knew the tray had not fallen. As he leaned over the crib to check the mark on my forehead, my brother's eyes met mine, really met them. adult to adult almost, over the gulf of 10 years and one impossible secret, and something in his face was not fooled at all. It was just kind, and it was just quiet about it. He straightened up before Yuna could reconstruct her question, herded her out with a story about the training yard, and left me with Momo and a cool cloth and my hammering heart. He knows, I thought, still hiccuping the tail end of my fake sobs. Or he knows there's something, and he covered it. He didn't tell. He just covered it. I didn't know yet what to do with a brother like that. I filed it. New variable, Tetsuo, aware, discreet, ally-shaped, handle with care. I want to tell you the training went smoothly after that. It didn't exactly, but it went steadily, which for an engineer is better. By my first birthday, I could teleport 3 pebbles before the plug pulled, or the spoon plus 1 pebble, which by rough mass I judged to be about the same total. By 14 months, 4. The curve was slow, brutally slow, the kind of slow that would make a shonen protagonist quit and take up farming, but it was real, and it was mine, and I could feel it, week over week, the tank growing a hair's breadth every night I emptied it clean. More than that, I was learning the sense. The spatial gift wasn't just a trigger you pulled. It was a whole perception, a knowing of where things sat in the volume of a room, of distances and gaps and the strange geometry of the skip that let a spoon be here and then be there without crossing between. The more I used it, the sharper the sense got, until I could feel the shape of the crib, the tray, the shutter's edge, the warm bulk of a person passing in the hall, all without opening my eyes. It was going to be, I understood dimly, extraordinarily useful in ways the clerk's word convenience didn't begin to cover, but I was still a baby. And that was the year I learned the hard limit of being a baby, which is that when the household hits a real crisis, the genius in the crib can do nothing at all. It was late winter, my second winter, and the food went bad. I pieced it together from the adults. Voices, from the tension that came into the house the way cold comes under a door. The winter stores the salted and pickled and root-cellared reserves that a barony's worth of household and a good part of the village leaned on to reach spring had spoiled. A run of unseasonable thaw and damp had gotten into the cellar. Half the stored roots had gone to rot and slime, the barrels of pickled vegetables had turned, and a good quantity of the salt-cured meat had grown a bloom nobody trusted. I understood, lying in my crib listening to my father's low, worried voice and my mother's quieter one, exactly what had happened and, worse, exactly how to have prevented it. Ventilation, cellar airflow, separating the produce that respires and rots from the cured goods that need cold and dry. Basic food storage engineering, the kind of thing my old world solved so thoroughly nobody thought about it. I knew a dozen fixes. I knew why it had spoiled, which is a thing not one person in that house could have told you, and I could do nothing. I couldn't speak, I couldn't stand, I couldn't so much as point. My total contribution to the survival of my own household through a lean, hungry late winter was to be one more mouth, and a small helpless one, teleporting pebbles in the dark. They got through it. Of course they did. Goro was a baron, if a poor one, and he did what poor barons do. He spent coin he'd rather have kept, buying grain and dried fish off a passing merchant at the bad late winter prices, and the household ate thin and simple until the spring greens came. Nobody starved. But I watched my father's face over those weeks tighten around the arithmetic of it. Watched him go quieter and stand a little longer at the window at night, and I understood something that reorganized my whole stupid plan. Being nobody wasn't free. Being nobody meant lying in a crib while the people who looked at a purple newborn and saw treasure went hungry from a problem I could have fixed in an afternoon with my mouth and my 2 hands, if only I had a mouth that worked and hands that reached. My promise to keep my head down to never let a single strange thing come to their door because of me, I'd made that promise to protect them. But protection cuts both ways. Sometimes the strange thing at the door is the thing that keeps the cellar dry and the family fed. I lay there in the lean end of that winter, small and useless and warm, they always made sure of that, even hungry, and I revised the plan. Not abandoned, revised. I stay quiet, I told myself. I keep my head down, but I grow. I grow the mana, I grow the body, I grow until I have a mouth that works and hands that reach, and a reason nobody questions to be clever. And then, carefully, so carefully nobody ever thinks it's strange I start making this house a little safer, a little richer, a little harder to hurt. Not for glory, not to be somebody, just so that the next time the cellar floods, the baby in the crib isn't the only one who knows why. It wasn't the comfortable retirement I'd asked the clerk for. It was going to be work, and I'd sworn off work. But lying there listening to my father not sleep at the window, doing sums in the dark over a spoiled cellar, I found I didn't mind the work half as much as I'd expected. It was different, wanting to fix a thing for people who'd cover for a baby with a spoon on his forehead. Very different from a quarterly report. So I emptied my tank one more time before sleep, 4 pebbles now, 5 if I stretched, and I let the gray come down, and I made myself a small, private, treasonous promise against the whole idea of being nobody. Grow faster. Spring came. The greens came up along the field edges, and the household ate green and laughed again. And my father slept. And in his crib, the forgettable second son turned 15 months old, could not yet walk, and had already begun, very quietly, to plan the rebuilding of the family cellar. The trick to fixing a household when you're 3 years old is that you never fix anything. You just happen to be nearby when it gets fixed. I'd learned to walk at the ordinary time a little late, if anything, because I was spending my body's energy on the mana instead of on ambition. I'd learned to talk carefully, hiding the vocabulary, salting my speech with the wrong words on purpose so that cellar came out cello. For a good 6 months after I could have said it clean, being underestimated is a resource. I hoarded it like the pebbles. And I had a plan for the cellar, refined over a year of lying in the dark thinking about airflow. You cannot, at 3, walk up to a baron and explain condensation. But you can toddle down the cellar steps after Momo, and you can be fascinated babbling, pointing by the one corner where the wall sweats and the rot always starts. You can cry inconsolably every single time you're carried past the barrels of pickled roots that sit jammed against the salt-cured meat until the adults, desperate to stop the noise, move the barrels apart just to see if it helps. And when Dantaro, the old manservant, mutters that the boy's got a nose like a hound for damp, you can beam at him like he's the cleverest man alive, because he just described the solution and thinks it was his idea. That's the whole method. Find the person who could have the idea. Make the idea irresistible. Give them the credit before they've even finished having it. The little lord doesn't like the wet corner, Momo told the cook, laughing, hauling me back up the steps. Won't stop wailing till we prop the door for the air. Then, prop the door, said the cook. So they propped the cellar door on dry days for airflow. They moved the respiring roots away from the cured meat. Dantaro, warming to his new reputation as a man who understood cellars, took it further on his own, dug a little channel to drain the sweating corner, raised the meat barrels on slats off the stone. By the following winter, the stores kept clean through the thaw, and my father, running his hand over dry, sound barrels in early spring, said to no one in particular, "Good year for the cellar." It was. I'd made sure of it. And not one soul in that house connected the sound cellar to the baby who'd cried at the wet wall, which was precisely, exactly, gloriously the point. I did it again with the well. There was a habit in the village of dropping the same wooden bucket down the shared well and hauling it up hand over hand, the rope laid coiled on the dirt where the chickens walked. I got sick twice that first year, bad gut sickness, and so did half the village children, and I knew why I knew, the way I knew why the cellar sweated, and I engineered a fix the same slow, invisible way. A horror of the rope touching the ground that I performed until a peg got driven to keep it coiled clean. A fascination with a lidded pot that migrated, over a season, into the idea of a lid for the well. Fewer children got sick, nobody knew why. Better year for the little ones, they said, and meant nothing by it. This is the part I have to confess, because I promised you honesty. I loved it. Not the fame, there wasn't any. That was the point. I loved the work. I loved finding a broken system and slipping a fix into it so cleanly that the system healed and never knew it had been touched. In my old life, I'd done work like this and gotten a spreadsheet and a boss who'd take the credit. Here I gave the credit away on purpose, to Dantaro and Momo and the cook and the well, and I kept the only thing I'd ever actually wanted from work, which turned out not to be recognition at all. It was the quiet, private knowing that the cellar was dry and the children were well, and I had done that. Nobody clapping, just the thing, fixed. I'd been so sure the office killed me because it never noticed me. Turns out it killed me because none of the work was mine. Give me work that's mine, and I'll do it in the dark for free, for a family that thinks I'm the slow one. I want to say a word about my mother here, because she belongs in this part of the story and she doesn't stay in it long. She was sick already. She'd been sick, quietly, since before I was born, some slow, wasting thing this world had no cure for, and through my early years she faded from the daily bustle of the house a little more each season. More warmth than person to a mind that had started as a screaming infant. I remember her in pieces, her thin hands, her voice, a few soft days near the hearth. She held on until I was 5, and then she went quiet, the way she'd been going quiet all along, only all the way. My father never spoke of it much. He kept the memory of her in small things, in the way he set out a bowl, in the manner he learned to place the pale reversey stones, which was her manner, careful and slow. I'll come back to her once, near the end, because a life should be closed and not just dropped. But she was there, in these years, fading at the edge of everything I built, and I built some of it for her, and she saw a little of it, and then she didn't. The mana kept growing, slow, always slow, but the curve had a shape now and the shape went up. By 4, I could teleport a full water bucket across the yard, not that I let anyone see it draining hard, but no longer blacking out from a single act. I'd expanded my range too. Not just across a room now, but across the whole cottage. The sense of the place mapped so completely in my head that I could feel, eyes shut, where every person sat, which is a thing that would matter enormously later, and that I mostly used at 4 to avoid being caught doing anything interesting. And I studied combat, which is funny, because I would never in my life throw a punch. Every morning, Goro trained Yuna in the yard. She was 9 now, and she wanted to be strong the way I'd once wanted a full night's sleep with a hunger that ate everything else. I'd sit on the step in the sun, pretending to doze, and I'd watch, and I'd log. Not to fight, to understand. Combat, it turned out, was a system like any other. Leverage, timing, the management of a resource called balance, the exploitation of an opponent's committed weight. Goro didn't teach it as a system, he taught it as feel, as a lifetime in his body he couldn't put into words. But I could put it into words, in my head, and I watched my sister lose the same way to the same overcommitment 100 mornings running, and I ached to tell her, and I didn't, because a 4-year-old does not correct a 9-year-old's footwork without questions I couldn't answer. I filed it. I filed everything. Someday, I thought, when it's safe, I'll find a way to give this to her the way I gave the cellar to Dantaro, slantwise. Free. My father, I should say, was a legend. I learned this in pieces from Dantaro's dry stories, from the way travelers went still when they heard the name Midorikawa, from the enormous notched sword that hung over the hearth and never came down. Goro had, in his youth, killed a dragon. An actual dragon, a young one, terrorizing a mountain pass, and he'd done it with that sword and a handful of men, most of whom didn't come back. It had made him briefly famous and permanently tired of fame. He'd taken the small barony they offered, come to Kohara, and spent 20 years being exactly the thing I'd wanted to be, comfortable, and nobody, and content. I understood him completely. It made me love him, and it made me nervous, because a man who'd fled fame that hard would not thank his son for dragging it back to the door. Keep it quiet, then. Keep it all quiet. The reversi was an accident. That's my story, and I'll die on it, again if necessary. Here is what happened. It was winter, I was 4, and I was bored. Bone bored, the specific boredom of an adult mind in a child's world with no games worth the name they had dice and a rough sort of drafts and nothing that engaged the part of my brain that had once done 6 spreadsheets in a meeting. And I missed games. I missed a thing with rules and depth and a table between 2 people, the way you miss a food you can't get. So I made a board. Not made I couldn't make anything. I had a 4-year-old's hands. But I could scratch an 8x8 grid into the packed dirt of the hearthside with a stick, and I could gather black stones and pale ones, and I could reconstruct from memory the whole clean, elegant rule set of a game my old world called Othello. Place a stone, flank your opponent's line, flip it to your color, the board a slow tide going back and forth until it's full. I taught it to Tetsuo first, because Tetsuo was safe. Tetsuo, who'd covered for the spoon, who watched me with those reading eyes and never once asked the question. I said I'd dreamed the game. He looked at the board, and he looked at me, and he did the thing he always did, decided the lie didn't matter, and he learned it. Then he beat me. Because I'd let him. A little. And because Tetsuo, quiet, bookish Tetsuo, had a mind like a still pond that saw straight to the bottom of the board. He beat me, and his serious face cracked into pure delight, and that was that. The house had a game. It spread like the gut sickness had, except backwards, everyone catching it, and glad. Momo learned it and lost cheerfully to everyone. Dantaro learned it and got quiet and dangerous over the board the way old soldiers do. Yuna learned it and hated losing at it so viscerally that she'd play it for hours to stop losing, which is exactly how you get good, and got good. Even my mother, in one of the soft, fading days I remember of her, sat with me on the hearth and placed the pale stones with her thin hands and let me flip them and smiled. And Goro learned it, and my legendary dragon-slaying father would sit hunched over an 8x8 grid scratched in the dirt, frowning at black stones like they were a mountain pass full of enemies, and lose to a 4-year-old, and demand a rematch, and lose again. "Where'd you dream this, boy?" he asked me once, not looking up, moving a stone. "Nobody dreams rules. Dreams don't have rules, that's what makes them dreams." "Dunno," I said, in my careful, salted wrong child's voice, and flipped 6 of his stones in one move. He stared at the ruin of his position. Then he threw his head back and laughed, that huge, cracked, joyful laugh from the first night, and cuffed me gently on the head and said, Gods. Second son's a menace, with so much helpless pride in it that I had to look at the board so he wouldn't see my face. I'd meant to stay nobody. I really had. But I was 4, and I was lonely for the specific company of a good game, and I'd wanted just once to sit across a table from someone and play. It was the first thing I made in this life purely because I wanted it, and not one bit of it was quiet, and I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Gemba arrived in spring, which is when the roads dry, and lost to me in an afternoon. He is enormous. Bigger than my father, and my father is a doorframe. A traveling adventurer, all shoulders and open, guileless face, who'd done some job with Goro years back and stopped in on his way through, the way people did, for a hot meal and a dry bed and stories of the dragon. He filled the whole main room just by standing in it. Yuna, 10 now, took one look at his sword-calloused hands and his easy strength and appointed him her rival on the spot, challenging him to arm wrestle before he'd got his boots off. He let her win, badly, unconvincingly, and she was furious, which delighted him, and then someone showed him reversey. I want to describe Genba's face when he first understood the game, because it's the face he made about most things, and it's why everyone loves him. It was not a clever face. Genba was not, in the conventional sense, bright. But when he understood reversey when the rule clicked, and he saw the tide of it, the way one stone could flip a whole line, his whole huge face lit up with a joy so total and uncomplicated that the entire room stopped to watch him have it. "You put it here," he breathed. "And then all of these, they turn? They just turn?" "They turn," said Tetsuo gravely. "Show me again." They showed him again. He played Dantaro and lost. He played Yuna and lost. He played at last, hunching his mountain of a body down to the hearth grid and squinting at the black and pale stones like they were a dragon's own riddle, the 4-year-old second son. I beat him in 11 moves. There was a silence. Genba looked at the board, where his stones had all quietly become mine. He looked at me, at the small, sleepy, careful child who'd just dismantled him. And instead of the wounded pride a grown adventurer might reasonably feel at losing to a toddler in front of the house, his face broke open into that same total uncomplicated joy, and he pointed at me with one enormous finger and said, to the room, delighted, "This one. This one's the smartest person I ever met." "He's 4, Genba," said Yuna, disgusted. "I know," Genba beamed, like this made it better. It did make it better. "Play me again, little lord. Please, I almost had it that time." He hadn't. He'd been nowhere near. But I set the stones back up, because how do you say no to that? And I let the game run long and taught him a little as we went, and by the end he'd blocked one of my lines entirely on his own, and was so proud he nearly wept. That was the day I acquired Genba, though I didn't know yet that I'd acquired him, that this baffled, good-hearted giant would attach himself to me and to this family and become, across everything that was coming, my constant shadow and shield. He left after a week and he came back. He always came back. He'd have walked through a wall for the boy who taught him the game where the stones turn. That night, after he'd gone off to bed, shaking the whole cottage with his snoring, my father sat down across the hearth grid from me and set up the stones without a word. We played. He lost, gracefully this time, and sat looking at the little board scratched in the dirt for a long moment. "People are going to hear about this game," he said finally. "Quiet. Not to me, quite. Travelers will carry it. Word gets around." He looked at me, and there was something in his tired, legendary eyes that I recognized, because I'd worn it myself, a man watching quiet start to slip. "You've got a clever head, Rito. Cleverer than a boy your age has any business with. I don't ask where from." A pause. "I only ask you keep it small." "Clever's fine. Clever's a gift, but famous," he touched, without seeming to notice, the notched sword over the hearth. "Famous costs. I paid it once. It's not worth what they tell you." I looked at my dragon-slaying father, who'd fled fame all the way to a mud road village and thought he'd gotten away, and I thought about a spoiled cellar and a well, and a game where the stones turn, and how quiet was already, quietly, slipping through both our fingers. "Small," I agreed, in my careful child's voice. I meant it too. That's the tragedy of it. I fully, genuinely meant it. The merchant Takiro rode into Kohara 11 days later. Takiro did not want the game. That's the first thing to understand. He rode into Kohara to buy wool and dried herbs at winter-cheap prices and sell them dear in the capital come spring, and he'd have ridden right out again if his cartwheel hadn't cracked on our miserable road and stranded him 3 nights at the roadside eatery. The eatery mattered, so let me back up. Kohara sat on a secondary road, not the great trade highway, but the lesser branch that fed it, the road you took to save a day if you didn't mind the mud. Because of the road, the village had an eatery, A long, low building with trestle tables where travelers stopped for a hot meal before the next stretch. It was run by a widow named Say, and it was, when I was small, exactly as good as it needed to be and not one bit better. Boiled roots. Thin stew. Bread you could use to shore up the cellar. Travelers ate because they were hungry, paid, and left, and nobody detoured a single step for the privilege. I'd been working on the eatery for a year, in my slantwise way, the way I'd done the cellar, not grand plans. Small ones, dropped where a grown-up could pick them up and call them their own. I'd gotten Say's daughter to try beating eggs with a little salt and cooking them in thin rolled layers instead of scrambling them to rubber. I'd done it playing. In Momo's kitchen first, a proper tamagoyaki, rolled and golden and sliced into neat spirals, and I'd made such a delighted production of eating it that the recipe walked itself over to the eatery inside a month. I'd gotten a boy to try grilling skewered chicken over the coals instead of boiling it gray, brushing it with the fat and salt as it cooked until the smell of it drifting to the road stopped carts on its own. Yakitori, though nobody called it that, they called it Say's skewers, and I let them, and the soy sauce. That one was slow, and I was still deep in it. I knew what soy sauce was, fermented soybean and wheat and salt and thyme, and I knew what it did to food, and I did not remotely know the exact microbe or the exact method, so I was running it the way I ran the mana. Experiment, log, adjust. Crocks of mashed cooked soybean and roasted cracked wheat and brine, tucked in a warm corner of Momo's kitchen, most of them failing. I'd learned early that the thing could not be rushed. The fermentation took months, half a year and more, the microbes doing their slow work in the dark whether I wanted them to hurry or not. So my one success that spring was a crock I'd laid down more than a year before, and half forgotten, which had ripened in its warm dark corner into something dark and savory and right. The sauce was good enough to brush on the skewers, and the skewers with the sauce on them were the single best thing to eat for 2 days. Ride in any direction, and nobody in the world knew that yet, except the travelers lucky enough to be stranded. Which brings us back to Takaido, and his cracked wheel, and his 3 unwilling knights. He ate the skewers the first night and grunted, which for a traveling merchant is a rave review. He ate them the second night and had 3 helpings and asked Say, carefully, casually, what was in the sauce, and Say, bless her, didn't know, because I'd only ever given her the finished crock and called it the little lord's brown stuff. And on the second night, he saw the game. 2 farmers had come in out of the wet, and they'd played reversey because everyone in Kohara played reversey now. It had spread through the village the way I'd known it would, a proper board and stones by then, whittled by an old man who'd taken it up as a winter craft. They played and they argued, and one of them cursed and slammed his fist on the table when the tide turned against him in a single flipped line, and Takaido, drinking his ale in the corner, watched 2 grown farmers play the same game for 2 hours and bet skewers on the outcome and care, viscerally care, about a game with stones. I know he watched because I was watching him. I'd made it my business, at 4, to be underfoot at the eatery whenever a merchant was stranded there, because merchants were the aquifer, and I was learning where the water ran. That game, Takaido said to Say on his way to bed. The stones, where's it from? Baron's boy dreamed it up, said Say. The little one. Rado. Takaido laughed. The Baron's got a clever brat then. And he went to bed, and I could see he'd filed it under nothing a child's amusement, a village oddity, the kind of thing merchants heard about and forgot on the next league of road. That was the problem I had to solve. Takaido didn't want the game. He didn't understand yet that he wanted it. And I could not, being 4, walk up to a merchant and explain a licensing model. So I did it through my father, which meant I first had to do it to my father, which was the hard part. Goro had told me to keep it small. Small, he'd said, touching the notched sword. Famous costs. I couldn't argue with him, not out loud, not as a 4-year-old. But I could arrange for him to argue with himself, and win, and think it was his own idea, the same method as the seller, aimed at the biggest and most stubborn system in my life. Here is what I knew that my father hadn't put together, because he was a warrior and not a merchant. The eatery was making money. Not much, but noticeably more travelers were staying longer, eating more, and crucially, choosing the muddy Kohara road over the clean one because of Say's skewers and the stone game and the general growing rumor that the poor branch village was worth the detour. That extra traffic paid tolls. Kohara had a toll, a modest one, a baron's right on the lesser road, and Dantaro kept the toll book, and the toll book was up, meaningfully up over the year. I got the toll book in front of my father. Not by handing it to him by being a menace about numbers at exactly the wrong moment, helping. Dantaro count coins on the table where Goro sat, saying tolls and roads and skewers and game in a tumbling 4-year-old babble until Dantaro, exasperated and fond, spread the book out to shut me up and said, "See, little lord, see, the road's busier, are you happy?" And Goro, glancing over, went still. Because Goro was a poor baron who'd lain awake at a window over a spoiled cellar, and a poor baron who sees his toll income up by a third in a lean year does not stay still for long. I watched him read the book. I watched him look at the eatery through the window, and at the reversey board on the shelf. And this was the moment. This was the whole play. I watched him understand that the fame he was afraid of and the security he was starving for were the same thing wearing two faces. The merchant asked about the game, he said slowly that evening to Dantaro, not to me, over my head the way adults do. Twice. Careful about it, like a man who's seen something he can use. Aye, said Dantaro. If it spreads the game, a merchant carries it to the capital, sells the boards, the game's everywhere in a season, and we've got nothing. Just a story about the village where it started. Goro's brow drew down. Or, Dantaro agreed, watching him. Dantaro, I'm fairly sure, understood me better than anyone in that house except Tetsuo, and never once said so. Or we don't sell the game, Goro said. We sell the right to make it. Per board, every board that merchant sells, we take a cut. Forever. He looked at his own hands like they'd surprised him. Is that a thing a man can do? It's a thing a lord can do, said Dantaro, with the right words in front of the right merchant. I sat under the table pretending to play with a stone and did not smile, which was the hardest physical act of my young life. The negotiation happened the third night before Takairo's wheel was mended, which was not an accident either. I'd made sure the wheelwright took his time, in my slantwise way, by being fascinated with the wheelwright's tools until the man showed off by doing the job slow and proper. You want to negotiate with a merchant while he's still stranded and a little bored, never while his cart's ready and the road's calling. Goro didn't try to be clever. That was his genius, actually, the thing I couldn't have coached into him. He was a legend and everyone knew it, and he sat down across from Takairo and was simply, honestly himself, a big, tired dragon slayer with a clever son and a road to keep. You like the game, Goro said. Takairo, cautious. It's a diversion. Children like it. Farmers played it 2 hours in my eatery and bet dinner on it. That's not children. Goro let that sit. You want to buy it off me? Take the rules to the capital, have boards made, sell them. I can see it on you. Takairo spread his hands, the honest merchant gesture that means a lie is coming. I could take a few boards off your hands, I suppose. Do you a favor? No, said Goro. And here he used the exact line I'd fed into the house over a week of babble, and hearing my own logic come out of my father's mouth in his own gruff words was the strangest, proudest thing. You don't buy the game. Nobody buys the game. The game's mine, my boys. You want to make boards and sell them? You make them under my name. And I take a cut of everyone every year for as long as they sell. You get the whole capital to yourself, first merchant with it, and I get a coin off each. That's the deal. Flat sale's not on the table. Takairo stared at him. I watched the merchant's whole face reorganize, watched him do the sum. The same sum I'd done a year ago in the dark. A flat sale is a bag of coin and then nothing, and a cut of every board forever is small at first, and then, if the game catches, it is a river. He was a good merchant. He saw the river. He also saw, being a good merchant, that he was being handled that a rural baron does not, unprompted, invent per-unit royalty licensing. His eyes flicked once to me, where I sat on the floor by the hearth stacking reversey stones into a tower, just for a second. Something moved behind his face. I knocked the tower over and giggled, because I was 4, and I was very good at 4. A cut of every board, Takairo said slowly, turning back to Goro. Forever. Every board. Forever. Your capital, your profit, my name, my coin off the top. Goro shrugged his mountain shoulders. Or you ride out tomorrow with your mended wheel and nothing, and in 2 years some other merchant carries the game past your door and you kick yourself the whole rest of your life. That last bit wasn't mine. That was pure Goro, the dragon slayer, who knew a thing or two after all about the fear of watching a great chance ride past. It was better than anything I'd have fed him. Takairo laughed, a real one this time, the laugh of a man who's been beaten to a good deal and knows it's still good. Your boy, he said, and glanced at me again. Dreams, useful dreams. And he put out his hand, and my father took it, and the first real coin of my second life began, invisibly, to flow. They wrote it down. Tetsuo did the writing, 10 years old and grave, his letters careful, and I sat on his lap, helping. and made very sure the terms came out clean, that the royalty was per board and perpetual, and tied to Takairo's own honest count with a right for Dantaro to check the books once a year. Small protections, the kind nobody misses until they save you. Takairo read it and nodded, and I saw him note every one of those small protections and revise his estimate of the household upward again. He came back through Kahara that autumn with the first payment, and it was more than the tolls, more than the eatery, more than my father had cleared off wool and herbs in the best year of his life because the game had caught in the capital exactly the way it had caught in our house, exactly the way it catches in any world with people bored enough to want a table between them and someone to beat. Takairo had added shogi too, I'd dreamed. That one for him on his way out, the deeper game, the general's game, and it had caught among the officers and the clerks who thought reversey beneath them and wanted something to feel clever about. He brought other things back with him that autumn. A cask of proper capital soy sauce, so I could finally taste what I was aiming at and correct my crocs against it. Better crocs. A fair price for the eatery's skewers to be carried, dried and portable, a little way down the road. He'd come stranded and reluctant and left a partner, and he could not stop looking at me sidelong, the 4-year-old menace who dreamed useful dreams. And I could not tell whether he'd decided I was a prodigy or something stranger, and I decided I didn't need to know as long as the coin kept flowing and my father slept easy. Because that's what it bought in the end. Not fame, the fame was coming. I couldn't stop that. I could already hear it in the way travelers said the clever Midorikawa boy one road further out every season. But it bought my father's sleep. It bought a cellar that would never flood again because now there was coin to line it in stone. It bought, say, a real kitchen and Yuna better steel to train with, and Momo a wage that let her send money home. It bought the family the one thing a poor barony never has, which is the room to breathe. On the night the first payment came in, Goro sat by the hearth counting it twice, disbelieving, and then he put the coin away and set up the reversey board and played me, and lost, and did not demand a rematch. He just looked at the little grid of black and pale stones for a long while. Small, he said finally. And there was something rueful in it now, something that already knew. I told you to keep it small. Small. I agreed in my careful child's voice and flipped his whole eastern line in one move. He laughed the cracked, joyful laugh and cuffed me gently and called me a menace, and neither of us said the true thing, which we both now knew, that it was already too late for small and had been since a lonely 4-year-old scratched an 8x8 grid in the dirt because he missed the feeling of a good game. 2 roads over, a traveler was teaching reversey to a stranger and saying, when the stranger asked where it came from, a clever boy, out in Kahara, the Dragon Slayer's son. The name was already walking, and it was walking toward the capital. 2 years is a long time when you measure it in coins, and I measured everything in coins now, the way my old self had measured everything in hours. I was 6. The barony was rich. Not noble rich we were still, on paper, a minor rural house with a mud road and a few fields. But the coin flow had changed everything downstream of it, and I'd spent 2 years documenting that change the way a startup founder documents a growth curve, in a private ledger I now kept for real, on real paper, because at 6, a boy who likes his letters and his numbers is merely precocious, not suspicious. Tetsuo had taught me to write, I'd let him. It had taken me an implausibly short time, and he'd watched me learn with those still reading eyes and said nothing, because that was our arrangement. The numbers went like this, and I want you to feel them the way I did. Year 1 of the royalty, the reversey cut came in and it was good better than tolls. I put none of it toward comfort. I steered it slantwise back into the road in the eatery because a growth curve you don't reinvest is a curve that flattens. Year 2. The cut roughly doubled as the game spread past the capital into the provinces, and shogi came in behind it, and Takairo no longer stranded. Now a partner who timed his circuit to pass through Kahara twice a year brought a proposal. Widen the road. The Kahara branch was mud, and mud was the ceiling on everything. Mud capped how many carts came, how fast, how heavy. Gravel the worst stretches, timber the wet crossing, and the branch stopped being the shortcut you took if you didn't mind the mud and became simply the better road. Goro balked at the cost. I'd expected that. So I did the thing I'd learned to do, which was to make the arithmetic irresistible and hand it to the person who could act on it. More cart traffic meant more tolls, and more tolls over 3 years paid the road twice over, and a better road meant more traffic, still a flywheel, the beautiful self-feeding kind, though my father called it the road paying for itself near enough. He borrowed against next year's royalty to do it, which made him nervous, and I sweated it too, quietly, because a leveraged bet in a medieval barony is a real bet with a real cliff. It paid. Of course it paid. I'd run the numbers a dozen ways in the dark. By the time I was 6, the road was gravel and timber where it counted. The cart traffic had better than doubled, and Kohara had gone from the poor branch village to the road with the good eatery and the smooth crossing, which is the kind of reputation that compounds. The eatery was the jewel, and the eatery was mine, though I'd given the credit away in pieces so small nobody held more than a sliver. Say ran it. Say's daughter ran the kitchen. But the identity of the place, the thing that made travelers plan their day around reaching it, that had grown, over 2 years, into a whole regional cuisine that existed nowhere else in the world, because it existed nowhere except my memory. The soy sauce had finally fully cracked. I'd spent 3 years on it, running crocs and failing and logging, and somewhere in there the method stabilized. Cooked soybean, roasted cracked wheat, the right salt brine, and a warm dark corner and patience. Months of it, the fermentation carrying itself once you'd got the start right. I had a soy shed now, an actual small building behind the eatery, rows of crocs, a village woman named Kane who'd taken to the craft and guarded her crocs like children, and who I'd trained by playing, until she thought she'd invented half of it. The sauce was dark and clean and savory, and it was, I say without false modesty, the best thing for 2 provinces in any direction because there was nothing else like it at all. On the sauce I built the rest. Yakitori the skewers, now made properly, brushed with the sauce, glazed dark over the coals. A rice dish, because I'd gotten rice growing in the wet field below the village. Hard work over 2 seasons to get the patty right, but rice grows if you flood it, and Kohara had water. Bowls of rice under grilled skewers with the sauce spooned over, which made travelers who'd eaten boiled roots their whole lives go quiet and then order a second bowl. A rolled egg, golden and sweet salt. Pickles done right, crisp and bright, not the gray mush of the old cellar. Travelers detoured for it. That's not a boast. It's a documented fact in my ledger. I could see it in Dantaro's toll book, in the days of the week patterns, carts that had no business on the branch road choosing it anyway because a driver had eaten Say's skewers once and would eat them again if he had to add half a day. Food is a technology. In my old world it was a solved problem, so thoroughly solved we forgot it was ever a problem. Here I had a 2-province monopoly on flavor because I remembered how, and it fed the whole flywheel. Better eatery, more travelers, more tolls, more coin for the road, better road, more travelers. And I did one thing at the eatery I probably shouldn't have. I did magic. Not real magic. Not real use of magic. I'd never let anyone see the useful things the spatial gift could do. The water buckets. The sense of the whole cottage. But my mana had grown enough by 6 that I could do small, showy, useless teleports on command without draining myself. And travelers at an eatery are a crowd, and a crowd wants a marvel. So Rado, the Baron's clever little son, did tricks. Made a coin vanish from one cup and appear in another across the table. Made a skewer he was carrying to a table simply beyond the table, a hand's-width jump, played for laughs, passed a stone through a closed box. It was, everyone agreed, a delightful sleight of hand, a gifted child's parlor tricks. Nobody thought it was real magic. Real magic in this world was a rare craft, guild-registered, done by robed mages with staves, not a 6-year-old palming coins for the amusement of carters. And that was exactly the cover I wanted. The truth, performed as a lie, hidden in plain sight and laughed at. I could teleport a marked coin through a sealed box in front of 40 witnesses, and every one of them would swear it was a trick, because a boy doing it for tips couldn't possibly be doing the impossible. It drew crowds. The crowds ate skewers. The skewers fed the flywheel. Even my own gift, the thing I'd sworn to keep quiet, I'd turned into a marketing engine and hidden it inside a joke. I was, I'll admit, a little proud of that one. Yuna was not thriving, and that's the part of these 2 years I have to tell honestly, because a house doesn't grow evenly, and I didn't see this one coming. She was 12 now, and she'd wanted one thing her whole life, which was to be strong enough to matter, strong the way our father was strong, Dragon Slayer strong. And the barony's rise had, without anyone meaning it to, quietly stolen her spotlight and handed it to her 6-year-old brother. Travelers didn't come to see the Baron's fierce daughter train with a sword. They came for the clever boy's game, and the clever boy's food, and the clever boy's little tricks. The house talked about the road, the coin, the eatery Rado this, the little lord that, and Yuna, who could have split a log with a wooden practice sword by 12, got a, "That's nice, dear," and went back to the yard alone. I saw it. I did. I just didn't know how to fix it without exposing myself, and so I did the coward's thing and let it slide, and it came out sideways, the way these things do. Gemba came through that spring he came through most springs now. He'd made a habit of the Kohara road, ostensibly for the skewers, mostly I think to lose at Reversey and be happy about it. And Yuna, 12 and full of a fury she couldn't name, challenged him to spar in the yard in front of the whole household and half the eatery's crowd, loudly, publicly, staking everything on it. Not arm wrestling this time, real sparring, wooden blades, the thing she'd trained for every morning of her life. I understood exactly what she was doing, because I'd done a version of it in my old life, the desperate public bid to be seen by a room that had stopped looking. She wanted the crowd back. She wanted it to be her the travelers talked about, the Baron's daughter who could beat a grown adventurer, and she'd convinced herself in the way of 12-year-olds that she could, that a year of hard training had closed a gap that had not remotely closed. And Genba, good-hearted, guileless, terrible at reading a room, Genba did not let her win. He wasn't cruel, he was the opposite of cruel. He simply didn't understand that he was supposed to throw it, because throwing a real spar in front of a crowd would have been, to Genba, a lie, and a kind of insult to a warrior who'd asked for a true fight. So he gave her a true fight. He let her come at him with everything, and he read her overcommitment, the exact overcommitment I'd watched her make 100 mornings and never been able to warn her about, and he stepped inside it and put her in the dirt, gently, twice, 3 times, until she stopped getting up quite so fast. The crowd, God's help them, laughed, not meanly. But they laughed, the way a crowd does when the outcome flips, and Yuna heard it, and I watched something close behind her eyes. She didn't cry. That was the worst of it. She got up the last time, and she bowed to Genba the way our father had taught her, correct and stiff, and she said, "Good fight," in a voice with nothing in it, and she walked out of the yard past all of us, past me, without a look. Genba's huge face crumpled with a dawning, delayed understanding that he'd done something wrong and no idea what. I went after her. 6 years old, I went after my 12-year-old sister, because I couldn't stand it, because for once being nobody wasn't worth the price. I found her behind the soy shed with her wooden blade across her knees. "He's stronger," she said before I could speak, not looking at me. "He's just stronger, and he'll always be stronger." And everyone came to watch you do your little coin trick, and they only watched me to see me lose. I sat down next to her in the dirt. And I broke a rule I'd held for years, and I gave her something I wasn't supposed to have. "You lunge," I said. She looked at me. "When you commit, you put your whole weight forward and you can't take it back, and he waits for it every time. Father does the same to you and you don't see it because he loves you and slows down. Genba doesn't slow down." I drew it in the dirt with a stick. The footwork, the weight, the way I'd logged it 100 mornings on the sunny step pretending to doze. You don't have to be stronger than him. You have to make him lunge instead. Wait longer than he can wait. He's got no patience. You've watched him play reversey. He throws his whole line at the first opening every time. Same in a fight. Bait it. Let him come. She stared at the diagram in the dirt. Then she stared at me. Really stared, the way Tetsuo stared, and I felt the ground move under our arrangement. "You're 6, she said slowly. "I watch a lot," I said. "I don't do anything else. You do things. You just do them a half-second too soon." I stood up and brushed off. "You're not slower than the coin trick, Yuna. You're better than the coin trick. Nobody who matters detours a road to watch a boy palm a stone. They just don't know yet what you are, because you keep handing them the ending they expect." I left her there with the diagram. I didn't stay to watch it land, because I'd already said far too much, and a 6-year-old who explains a warrior's overcommitment is a 6-year-old who gets asked questions. She didn't ask them, not then. But she trained differently. After that, I saw it from the step, the lunge coming out of her footwork week by week, the patience coming in, and though she wouldn't beat Genba for years yet, she stopped losing the way she'd lost. And she'd catch my eye sometimes across the yard, over the wooden blades, with a look I couldn't fully read. Half suspicion, half something that might in time become trust. I'd handed my sister a real secret to save her a hurt I couldn't bear to watch, and now she held a corner of me, the way Tetsuo did, the way Dantaro almost certainly did. My quiet was getting crowded with people who knew. The letter came in autumn, carried by Takaido on his second circuit, and it was addressed to my father in a fine capital hand with a seal I didn't recognize, and my father did. He read it twice at the hearth, the way he'd counted the first coin twice, and his face did a complicated thing. "Your grandparents," he said finally to the room, to Tetsuo and Yuna, and over my head, to me. "My mother and father. They've heard things, about us. About the road, and the coin, and the game," and his eyes flicked to me, and away, the clever son. "They want us to come to the capital, visit, be seen." "We've never been to the capital," said Tetsuo quietly. "No," said Goro. "We haven't. I made sure of it." He set the letter down. The notched sword hung over him on the wall, catching the firelight. "When I took this barony, I took it to be forgotten. My family's there, a real house in the capital. Old. I was the son who went off and killed a dragon and got famous and hated it and ran to the mud to be nobody. And they let me go because a rural branch that stays poor and quiet is no threat and no help and no bother to anyone. He looked around at us, the rich eatery, the good coin, the road that paid for itself, the clever son who dreamed useful dreams. We're not poor and quiet anymore. They noticed. And when a family like mine notices a branch that's grown, they don't leave it alone. They come to see what they can use. He picked the letter back up and turned it in his big scarred hands, and for the first time since the spoiled cellar, I saw the old fear in him, the fame fear, awake and looking straight at me. "You did this, Rito," he said, not angry, just true. "I don't know how, and I stopped asking, but you did this. And now it's carried our name all the way back to the door I ran out of." He almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "So, get your good clothes, all of you. We're going to the capital." I looked at the letter, and the seal, and my father's fear, and I thought about a clerk in a white room with a stack of glowing tablets, apologizing for a routing error, telling me quiet's harder to keep than people think. He hadn't been kidding about that either. The capital was 5 days on the good road and 1 on the great highway, and it was the biggest thing I'd seen in either of my lives. I don't mean bigger than Tokyo. Nothing here is bigger than Tokyo. I mean that Kohara was a village of around 300 souls, though it grew with every season, and I'd never in this life stood in a place with more people than that, and the capital had tens of thousands, walls you couldn't see the end of, a river with stone bridges, districts that each had more folk than my whole province. I sat in the cart with my face pressed to the rail like the child I was supposed to be, and for once I didn't have to fake the wonder. We came in with Genba as escort he'd insisted, and my father had allowed it, and a giant with a sword walking beside the cart made the last leagues of highway a great deal quieter than they might have been. Takaido rode ahead to see to his own business, and I suspected to spread word of our arrival in the useful directions, because a merchant with a reversey monopoly does not waste the arrival of his golden goose's family in the capital. The plan, such as it was simple, and it was my father's. Be seen, be pleasant, stay small, get home. Visit the grandparents, endure whatever inspection the old house wanted to make of its grown branch, give them nothing to grab, and ride back to the mud with our name intact and our royalty unmolested. I had a private amendment to the plan, which was, understand the machine. I'd spent 6 years running a village. The capital was where the province's real power lived, the great houses, the merchant companies, the magic guild that decided what counted as magic and what didn't. If our name had reached this far, I needed to know the shape of what it had reached, because you cannot stay quiet in a system you don't understand. So I watched. I always watched. The girl was lost near the West Market, and I stopped for her because I couldn't not, and it turned out to matter, though not the way you'd think. She was small, younger than me, sitting on a doorstep crying with the particular hopeless quiet of a child who's been lost long enough to stop expecting to be found. The crowd flowed past her the way crowds do. I made my father stop. I was good at making my father stop, 6 years of practice, and I crouched down and asked her the questions you ask a lost child, calm and specific, the way you debug a stalled process. Not, are you lost? But, who brought you here, and where were you standing when you last saw them? And, what does she look like? What is she wearing? Where does she go every day? An academy student, the girl said, hiccuping. Her big sister. Studies at the Magic Academy, walks her to the market on rest days, and the sister had stopped to argue prices, and the girl had wandered after a dog, and now the world was all legs and noise. The academy I could work with. The academy had a fixed location and fixed people, and a sister who'd lost a small child on a rest day would go, once she'd searched the market and failed, to the 2 places that made sense. Back to the last spot she'd seen the girl, or to the city watch. I took the girl to the last spot because that's where you go first and where a frantic sister would circle back to. And I was right, the sister came pelting through the crowd not 10 minutes later, white-faced, and the reunion was the loud, tearful kind. And the sister thanked my father and thanked Genba, and thanked, last and most bewildered, the small boy who'd apparently run the search like a captain of the watch. It was nothing. It cost me 20 minutes. But the sister was an academy student, which meant she talked to academy people, and a story about a strange, calm little boy from the branch of the Dragon Slayer's family who'd found her lost sister. By reasoning, that story went into the academy, into exactly the pool of people who paid attention to strange children. I didn't do it for that. I did it because a kid was crying on a doorstep. But I noted, filing it, that kindness in a capital travels through the same channels as fame, and I just, without meaning to, deposited some. I did the street performance for the wrong reasons, and I knew it while I did it, which is the truest kind of mistake. We had a free afternoon before the grandparents, and the West Market had a corner where performers worked for tips jugglers, a fire eater, a man with a trained bird. And I was 6, and I'd spent 5 days in a cart, and I was, if I'm honest, a little drunk on the size of the place, on being nobody in a crowd so large that nobody knew me at all. In Kahara, everyone knew the little lord. Here I was, one small child among tens of thousands, gloriously anonymous, and some contrary part of me, the part that had scratched a reversey board in the dirt because it was lonely, wanted, just once, to be seen by strangers who owed me nothing. So I did the tricks, the eatery tricks, the coin through the box, the vanish and appear. I did them for a market crowd, and a market crowd is bigger and hungrier for marvels than an eatery, and I was better at them now, my mana grown enough that I could jump a coin the whole width of a performer's circle and make it land in a stranger's raised palm. The crowd loved it. They threw coins. A child doing sleight of hand that good was a genuine delight, and I fed on the delight the way I'd sworn never to feed on anything, and I did one trick too many. I teleported a marked coin from a watchman's own belt pouch, a heckler, arms crossed, sure it was a trick and saying so, into the fire eater's closed water jug across the circle, and had the fire eater pour it out to the crowd's roar, and the watchman checked his pouch and went pale, because a coin he'd have sworn no child had touched was gone from a closed pouch on his own hip. In the crowd, 3 men in the gray robes of the Magic Guild stopped laughing. I saw them the instant it was too late. Guild mages, off-duty by the look of them, drawn to a street corner like anyone, and where a market crowd saw sleight of hand, 3 trained mages saw a boy move a marked object out of a sealed pouch across 10 feet of air with no line of contact. And that is not a trick. That is spatial magic, rare and registered, and absolutely not the sort of thing a 6-year-old street performer should be able to do. Their faces did the thing I'd spent 6 years making sure faces never did. They went from entertained to troubled, and one of them said something to the other 2, and I gathered my thrown coins and my family with a speed that was itself a mistake, and we left the market corner faster than a delighted child should ever want to leave applause. "That last one," said Tetsuo quietly, walking close beside me. Not accusing, reading, as always. "The pouch. That wasn't a trick, was it?" "It was a trick," I said. "Rito." "It was a trick," I said again, and Tetsuo let it go, because that was our arrangement, but his jaw was tight, and I understood that I'd frightened him. Not with the magic, with the recklessness. My steady, careful little brother had watched me be careful for 6 years and had just watched me, for one afternoon of applause, be a child. Genba, oblivious, was ecstatic. The pouch. Did you see the watchman's face? Best one you've ever done, little lord. That was better than the game." "Thank you, Genba," I said, and meant it, and hated that I'd done it. My grandparents. House was a stone thing in the noble district, 3 stories, older than the road my family lived on, and my grandmother met us in a hall with a floor so polished I could see the beams reflected in it, and she was not warm. She wasn't cruel either. She was worse than cruel. She was assessing, the way Takaido had been assessing the first night over the reversey board, except where Takaido assessed for profit, my grandmother assessed for use and threat, the twin instincts of an old house. She looked at Goro, her runaway dragonslayer son, with a complicated mix of resentment and reluctant pride. She looked at Tetsuo and catalogued him. Eldest, bookish, biddable, useful. She looked at Yuna and dismissed her. A warrior girl, decorative, no leverage there, which made my grandmother a fool about my sister and I filed the mistake to use later. And she looked at me for a long, long moment. "So this is the one," she said. "The clever one. The whole capital has heard the Dragon Slayer's poor branch got rich off a child's game and a roadside kitchen." She said, "Poor branch and child's game and kitchen, the way you'd handle something a little soiled. You've done well, Goro, better than we expected of the mud. Well enough that people are asking who really runs your barony." Her eyes came back to me. "Some of them wonder if it's a 6-year-old. "It's not," said Goro flat. "No," my grandmother agreed, watching me. "Of course not. That would be absurd." She did not believe it for a second. Old houses got old by not believing convenient things. "But a house with a gift like this in it, wasted in the mud, growing wild where anyone might pick it, that's a waste, Goro. The boy should be here, in the capital, with the family, educated, guided. Not doing coin tricks for carters on a branch road." And there it was. The grab. Not crude. She wasn't asking to take me, not out loud, not yet. She was planting it. The boy belongs to the house. The house should guide the gift, a branch that's grown too valuable to leave alone. I'd predicted this on the road, and it was still a cold thing to hear said in a polished hall by a woman who shared my blood and looked at me like an asset on a ledger. I did the only thing available to a 6-year-old, which was to be small. I yawned. I leaned on my father's leg. I said, in my careful child's voice, "Grandmother, is there food? Gemba says capital food is bad. Is it bad?" And I watched her recalibrate, watched her file me back down toward just a clever child after all, because a boy who whines about dinner is not a boy who runs a barony, and old houses, for all their instinct, will always take the easy read over the true one if you hand it to them nicely. Goro's hand rested on my head, heavy and warm, and I felt it tighten just slightly, and I knew he'd understood the grab exactly as I had. "He's my son," Goro said, quiet. To his mother, the matriarch of an old house, in her own polished hall. "Not the house's, mine. He stays in the mud with me, where he's happy. We came to be seen. You've seen us. That's all we came for." The temperature in the hall dropped a degree. My grandmother's assessing eyes went from Goro to me and back, and she smiled, and the smile was the smile of someone who has all the time in the world and knows that a branch which has grown this valuable this fast will keep growing, and that valuable things have a way of coming to the house that wants them, one season or another. "Of course," she said. "Stay in the mud then, for now. Dinner's this way. It isn't bad. The dinner wasn't bad. It also wasn't as good as the eatery, which I did not say, but Genba did, loudly, and I loved him for it." The guild came the next morning, and it was Horn. I didn't know his name yet. I knew only that a man in the gray robes, older, precise, with the particular self-importance of a mid-rank official in a rare and prestigious craft, presented himself at my grandparents' door and asked to speak with the family about an incident in the West Market involving a child and an unregistered manipulation of a sealed object. He'd been sent. The 3 off-duty mages had reported it, and the guild had traced it. It isn't hard to trace the Dragon Slayer's visiting grandson, and Horn had come to look at me the way you look at a problem that offends you. He was very polite and entirely dismissive, which is a specific combination I knew well from a life of meetings. He examined me. He asked me to do the trick, and I did the smallest, most obviously fake version I had, a palmed coin badly hidden, deliberately clumsy, and he watched it, and his lip curled. "Sleight of hand," he pronounced. As I suspected. The witnesses were excited by a market performance, and their memories improved the story. This, a small gesture at me, dismissive, is a gifted child with quick hands and a talent for misdirection, not magic. Certainly not spatial magic, which is among the rarest disciplines in the realm and requires years of guild training that no child of 6 in a mud village could possibly have received. He said it to my father, over my head. "You understand, I have to be thorough. Rumors of unregistered magic must be run down. But there is nothing here. A parlor trick. The guild's time has been wasted." He was, in one sense, entirely right. A child of 6 could not have guild training. And in every sense that mattered, he was entirely, catastrophically wrong, and he was wrong on purpose, because the truth was inconvenient and impossible, and he was the sort of man who would always take the read that let him leave. He'd looked straight at a genuine spatial mage and certified him a fraud, because certifying him real would have meant admitting the guild's whole model of who could do magic was broken by a boy and borrowed good clothes. I let him. Gods, I let him gladly. A guild that thought I was a fraud was a guild that left me alone. I made my clumsy trick even clumsier and let Horn walk out sneering, dismissing me in front of my father and grandmother as a child with quick hands, and it was the best possible outcome, and I should have been thrilled. Tetsuo watched Horn go with that tight jaw. "He's wrong," my brother said very low, only to me, "and you let him be wrong, on purpose." "Being called a fraud is the safest thing that's happened all week," I said. "For now," said Tetsuo, and there it was again, "for now," the same 2 words my grandmother had used, and I understood that both of them, the matriarch and the scholar, the one who wanted to use me and the one who loved me, had seen the same thing I refused to look at directly. That fraud was a mask that only held until someone had a reason to look under it. That the capital was full of people who'd noticed the branch had grown. And that quiet, once it starts slipping, does not slip back. We left 3 days later, and I was glad to see the highway. But we didn't leave clean, and I knew it in my bones. Somewhere in the capital, an old woman was thinking about a valuable branch and a season to come. Somewhere in the guild, a precise man had filed away a name he'd sneered at. And somewhere, this I only learned later, a minor noble named Lucas Vance had heard, over wine, that the reversey rights that were minting quiet money all over the capital belonged not to a real house at all, but to a rural baron out in the mud, some dragon slayer, held it all on a handshake and a merchant's honesty, and had set down his cup and smiled, and thought that a rural baron's lucky trick was surely a thing a real capital noble could simply take. I didn't know Vance's name yet either. I was 6, and I was going home, and the wheat would be high in the fields, and I told myself I'd been careful enough. I hadn't. But the wheat really was high, and Kahara really was home, and for the length of the ride back I let myself pretend the capital was behind us for good. Lucas Vance's letter reached my father before we'd finished the summer's harvest, and it was a masterpiece of legal aggression dressed as courtesy. I read it over Goro's shoulder, and I translated it in my head from noblespeak into what it actually said, which was this: a rural baron cannot hold commercial rights within the capital's jurisdiction. Such rights require registration with the capital's commerce court, which your handshake arrangement lacks. As a properly seated capital noble, Baron Vance is prepared to assume the reversi and shogi rights and administer them lawfully, offering your family a modest one-time consideration for your trouble. Signed, etc. It was a robbery. It was also, and this was the poison in it, plausible. Vance wasn't wrong that our arrangement was a handshake to Cairo's honest count, Dentaro's yearly check of the books, a written agreement between a baron and a merchant that had never seen the inside of a capital court. In the mud, that was ironclad. In the capital, where Vance had friends among the officials who registered such things, it was a technicality waiting to be exploited. My father read it, and his face went to the flat, dangerous stillness I'd seen exactly once before, the stillness of the man who'd killed a dragon. He wants to steal the game, Goro said. He wants to steal the game, I agreed. I didn't bother with the child's voice. We were past that, in this room, with this letter. My father had stopped asking where my cleverness came from years ago. Now, quietly, when the door was shut, he'd started asking me questions. I can go to the capital, Goro said. I can find this Vance and I can explain in person what a mistake he's made. His hand was near the notched sword. He meant it. He would have, too, ridden to the capital and stood in Vance's hall and been, very quietly, the Dragon Slayer, and it might even have worked once, through pure fear. No, I said. You can't fight this one, father. You fight him, and you prove his whole point a mud baron who solves capital problems with a sword. That's the story he wants. He wants you to be the brute from the branch. Then he takes the rights in your name. I took the letter from his hand and read the specific phrases again, the ones about jurisdiction and registration and lawful administration. He's not attacking us with a sword. He's attacking us with the shape of the law, so we don't fight him with a sword. We change the shape of the thing he's trying to grab until there's nothing left to grab. Goro looked at me for a long moment. 6 years old, standing in his study explaining commerce court jurisdiction. Explain, he said. Just that. And that one word my legendary father, asking his small son to explain, was the moment our arrangement changed for good, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so. Here's the flaw in Vance's plan, and it was the same flaw I'd built the whole royalty on 3 years ago without knowing I'd someday need it. Vance thought he was seizing a patent and ownable, transferable right to make the game, a thing you could take, hold, and profit from once it was yours. And if the value of the reversi business had lived in the patent, he'd have been right, and we'd have been finished. But the value didn't live in the patent. I'd never let it. The rules of reversi weren't a secret. You couldn't hide an 8x8 grid, and a rule about flipping stones. Anyone who'd played it could make a board. If the value had been in owning the rules, it would have leaked years ago, patent or no. The value lived somewhere Vance couldn't see because merchants like Takiro could see it and nobles like Vance couldn't. It lived in the ongoing thing. In Takairo's distribution network, the wagons and warehouses and shop contracts that got boards into every town. In the reputation that a Midorikawa board, stamped with our name, was the real one, the original, the one the game came from. In the fact that the game was tied in every player's mind to a story, and the story was ours. You could seize the right to stamp our name on boards. You could not seize the truth of where the game came from, and you could not seize Takairo's wagons, and you could not seize the reputation, because reputation isn't a thing you hold, it's a thing people decide, and people decide it fresh every day. So I restructured. Working through Goro's authority and Takairo's mechanics, over a hard month of letters writing back and forth on the good road, we changed the arrangement so that its value became untakeable. We formally split it. Takairo's company owned the distribution, the wagons, the network, the supply outright and independently, registered clean in the capital as a merchant company's ordinary business, which no rural jurisdiction argument could touch. Our family kept only the name right and the origin a thing of reputation, tied to us personally, worth everything and worth nothing, because it could not be transferred to anyone the players didn't already believe. So if Vance takes the rights, Goro said slowly, working through it at the hearth, the reversey board between us as always, he takes the right to put his name on boards, but Takairo's company makes the boards, and the shops, and the players still think the real game comes from us. He takes an empty box, I said, and flipped a line of his stones. He goes to all the trouble of a commerce court seizure. He wins his little legal fight over jurisdiction, and what he holds at the end is the right to stamp Vance on boards that nobody wants, made by no wagons he controls, competing against Takairo's network that has every shop in the realm and our name on every board that matters. He'll have spent a fortune in bribes and favors to steal a thing that turns to smoke the moment it's his. I set my last stone. Let him win the case. Winning the case is the trap. Goro stared at the board, where his position had just collapsed, and then he started to laugh the cracked, joyful laugh, but quieter now, with something new under it, a kind of awe. God's boy, he said. You let him win, so the winning ruins him. He'll do the work of humiliating himself, I said. We just have to make sure he does it in public. The public part was where I had to appear, and I'd have preferred not to, but some things you can't do slantwise. Vance, sure of his legal ground and hungry to establish himself as the man who'd tamed the reversey rights, made the mistake I'd been counting on. He made it about pride. He challenged the family, through channels, to a public exhibition of the game his champion against ours in the capital, before an audience of the nobles and merchants who mattered. His idea was a coronation. He'd beat the Mudd family at their own game in front of everyone, then complete the legal seizure while the humiliation was fresh, and cast himself as the rightful, superior owner. A rural baron's lucky trick, defeated by a real capital lord. He'd hired a champion, a known player, one of the strongest in the capital, a man who'd made a small name at the game since it arrived. And our family's champion, by right of origin, by the whole story of the thing, was obvious. So I went back to the capital. 7 years old now, in good clothes, my father a wall of quiet muscle behind me, Takairo working the crowd, Genba at the door looking enormous and cheerful, and I sat down across a proper reversey board from Vance's champion in a hall full of the exact people my grandmother had warned me were watching the branch. I will not pretend it was a hard game. It was not. I had played this game in another life for 20 years and thought about it in this one for 3, and Vance's champion was a strong amateur who'd had the game for a few years, and the gap between us was the gap between a man who's read about the sea and a man who was born in it. I could have won in a dozen moves and shamed him. I didn't. That was the whole art of it, and it was pure old Kenta, pure the quiet way. I let the game breathe. I let the champion have positions that looked winning to a hall full of people who half understood the game. I let Vance, sitting forward in his fine chair, begin to smile, begin to believe his coronation was arriving on schedule. I let the tide of the board turn slowly, visibly, in the champion's favor, and then I let it turn back, one flipped line at a time, in a long, elegant, undeniable collapse, so that even the nobles who barely knew the rules could watch the Mudd Baron's 7-year-old son take apart the capital's champion not with a lucky trick, but with obvious, patient, total mastery. It ended with the board almost entirely my color, and a silence, and then the particular murmur of a crowd that has watched pride die. I stood up and bowed to the champion, correct and stiff, the way my father had taught Yuna, and I said, "Good game," in a voice with respect in it, because the champion had done nothing wrong except be hired by a fool. And then I turned to Lucas Vance, who was no longer smiling, and I did the only cruel thing I did that whole day, which was to be gracious. "Baron Vance," I said in my clear child's voice, pitched to carry to every corner of the hall. "Thank you for arranging the game. It's the best attended match we've ever had. My family will remember your generosity in bringing so many important people together to see the original game played." I bowed to him too. "You honor our little village." I made him the man who'd gathered the capital's finest to watch a 7-year-old from the Mudd humiliate his hired champion and then thank him for it. There was no counter to it. He couldn't rage at a gracious child would finish what the game had started. He couldn't gloat, there was nothing to gloat over. He sat in his fine chair with the whole hall's attention on him and the whole hall's opinion curdling, and he understood, I watched him understand, that his coronation had become his tombstone, and that the legal seizure he'd worked so hard to arrange was now a thing he could not possibly go through with, because to seize the rights now, in front of these people, after this, would only make him the petty noble who'd tried to steal a beloved game from a brilliant child and failed even to beat him at it. He withdrew the claim within the week, quietly, the way you withdraw from a fight you've already lost in every way that isn't official. He'd spent his fortune in favors and gotten a public humiliation that would follow him for years, and we hadn't raised a hand, hadn't even technically done anything but play a game and say thank you. The trap was that winning it was the loss. Horn was almost an afterthought, but I wanted him, and I'll admit that freely. Not for revenge. For safety, Horn had certified me a fraud, and a fraud is a thing that can be uncertified the moment someone with more standing than Horn decides to look. As long as my magic hung in the air as an open question sleight of hand or something more, I was exposed. The safest thing wasn't to stay uncertified. The safest thing was to be certified as exactly real on the record, so thoroughly that the question was closed forever and nobody could reopen it to threaten my family. Also a little, because he'd sneered at me in front of my father. The exhibition hall was full of important people who'd just watched me play. I made sure the guild was represented. Cairo saw to it, an invitation Horn could not decline without looking like he was ducking. And after the game, while the humiliation of Vance was still settling over the room, I asked, in my clear child's voice, whether the honored guild appraiser who'd examined me last year would care to see the market trick again, properly this time, since so many people had heard the story and the guild had said it was nothing. Horn could not say no. Saying no in that hall after that game would have looked like fear. So he agreed, condescending, ready to expose the child's fraud once and for all before the capital's finest. I asked him to provide the object. His own nothing I could have touched or prepared. He gave me his guild seal ring, a heavy signet he wore, marked and known to every mage present, off his own hand. I asked a second guild mage to hold a locked marked box and never let it leave his hands. And then, standing across the hall from both of them, in full view, with no contact and no line and no possible sleight of hand at that distance, I put Horn's own seal ring inside the locked box. The mage opened the box with the crowd craning. The ring was inside. Horn checked his own hand. Empty. And the ring in the box, his own known ring, and the whole polished machinery of his self-importance seized up because there was no explanation that let him keep his position and his story. It could not be sleight of hand. He'd provided the object himself. He'd handed it over with his own fingers. He'd watched it the whole time. A child had moved a heavy signet ring across a hall into a locked box with nothing in his hands. That is spatial magic. Rare, registered, real. Certified in front of the entire capital by the very man who'd called it a parlor trick because Horn, cornered, could either admit the truth or admit that he'd been wrong last year, and either way the truth was now the only door left in the room. He signed the registration himself, at my grandmother's own polished table 3 days later, with the sour, precise face of a man eating his own words. Rito Midorikawa, spatial magic verified, on the record, closed forever. The record noted at the bottom that the origin of the boy's gift could not be established, and that the case was without precedent, which suited everyone, because an unexplained thing is easier to file than to fight, and a guild that cannot account for a self-taught child prefers, always, to stamp the mystery and move on, rather than admit its whole model of who can do magic has a hole in it. The question that could have threatened my family was now an official, boring, settled fact, and a settled fact is the safest thing in the world, because nobody investigates what's already known. You could have hidden it forever, Tetsuo said to me that night, quietly, in the room we shared at the grandparents' house. He wasn't reading me now. He'd stopped needing to. You spent years hiding it, and you just showed the whole capital. I hid it to be safe, I said. It stopped being safe. So I made it public, which is the other kind of safe. A secret is a thing people can find. A known fact is a thing people forget. I lay back on the strange soft capital bed. I'm not hiding anymore, Tetsuo. Not because I gave up on quiet. Because I finally understand quiet was never about being invisible. It was about being left alone. And the way you get left alone isn't to hide. It's to be too settled to bother. Tetsuo was quiet for a while in the dark. You beat 2 grown men this week, he said finally. A noble and a guild master. You're 7. I beat a game and a ring, I said. I never touched either of them. That's the whole trick, Tetsuo. You never fight the man. You change the board until the man's already lost. We rode home to the mud with our name intact, our rights untakeable, our magic settled fact, and Lucas Vance and Master Horn behind us as footnotes who'd learned, expensively, not to reach for the branch. My grandmother saw us off with an expression I couldn't fully read: resentment, still, and use, still, but under it something that might have been the first grudging respect an old house can feel for a branch that has proven it cannot be simply taken. For now, her eyes said, but for now had bought years. And years, to an engineer, are just time to grow. I had won. That was the strange thing. I had actually completely won the thing I'd been fighting for since a spoiled cellar when I was 15 months old. The family was safe, The rights were untakeable, the coin flowed, the enemies were footnotes. And I came home to Kahara at 7 years old with nothing left to fix, and discovered that I had no idea how to stop. Let me describe the piece, because I did get it, for a season, and it was everything I'd asked the clerk for. Autumn in Kahara after we came back from the capital, the wheat inn, the paddy gold, the eatery so busy that Say had hired 3 more from the village, and the smell of grilling skewers and soy glaze hung over the whole road like weather. The soy shed had 6 women in it now under Kane, who ran it like a queen and had genuinely, at this point, invented improvements I hadn't taught her, which delighted me more than anything I'd built myself. The village had 200 more people than when I was born, drawn by the work, and none of them went hungry through the winter, because the cellar was stone-lined now and dry and full, and I had made that true, and nobody knew, and that was still the sweetest thing I owned. I read. My grandmother, of all people, had sent a crate of books home with us, a calculated gift, I knew, an investment in the valuable branch, guiding the gift the way she'd said she would, but I didn't care about the calculation because the books were real books, histories and geographies and treatises on the crafts of this world, and I fell on them the way I'd fallen on food as a hungry infant. I learned the shape of the realm, the trade routes, the other provinces, the coast, the merchant companies, the guilds. I built the model of the world I'd wanted since the cart ride to the capital, and I built it by a warm fire with a bowl of rice and grilled fish at my elbow, and it was, for a while, exactly the life the salaryman had died wishing for. Tetsuo taught me letters I pretended not to know. That was our game now, our arrangement made gentle. He'd sit me down with a primer and teach me the characters, grave and patient, and I'd learn them slowly, making the mistakes a 7-year-old makes, and he'd correct me kindly, and we both knew I could read the histories in that crate better than he could, and neither of us said so, and it was one of the warmest things in my life. He did it because he loved teaching, and I let him because I loved being taught by someone who loved me, and the pretense was the affection. Some lies are how you say I care. Momo's cooking disasters were a household institution. She'd risen with the house. She managed the whole domestic side now, wages and stores and the 3 new maids, and she was good at it, sharp and warm and organized. But she still, when she cooked for the family herself out of love on the maids' rest day, produced catastrophes of ambition, and the whole family ate them with straight faces and enormous praise, and Momo knew we were lying and loved us for it, the way Tetsuo and I loved each other over the primer. That's a family. A family is a house full of people lying kindly to each other about the important things. Dentaro told stories by the fire, dry and slow, and I'd finally worked out that half of them were about my father in the dragon years, told sideways, so Goro wouldn't have to hear himself praised, and that the old manservant had known what I was since roughly the cellar, and had decided, in his soldier's way, that a house is defended by keeping its useful secrets and never mentioning them. He'd caught my eye once, that autumn, while I helped him with the toll book, and he'd said, apropos of nothing, "A good quartermaster wins more wars than a good general, little lord. Nobody writes songs about him. He doesn't mind," and gone back to the book. That was Dantaro telling me he understood me completely. It was the closest thing to being seen that I'd let myself have in 7 years, and I nearly wept over a toll ledger. I trained with Goro. Not to fight, I'd never fight, but he'd started including me in the yard, gently, because a boy should move his body, and because I think he wanted the time. And I discovered I liked it, the plain physical work of it, the way it emptied my endless calculating head the same way emptying my mana emptied it. Yuna trained beside us, 15 now, and she'd become something, the lunge gone from her footwork, the patience in, a warrior who no longer lost the way she used to. She'd catch my eye across the yard sometimes with that look I still couldn't fully read, the half-suspicion softened now into something like a shared secret, and once she said, low, so father wouldn't hear, "You still watch everything, don't you?" "You watched me my whole life." And I said, "Somebody had to." And she snorted and knocked me into the dirt gently, and that was Yuna saying thank you for a diagram drawn behind a soy shed years ago. Our mother wasn't in these autumn evenings, and that was the one empty chair in all the warmth. She'd been sick a long time, the slow-wasting thing this world had no cure for, and she'd gone quiet all the way when I was 5, faded out of the daily bustle of the house the way she'd been fading since before I was born. My father never spoke of it much. He kept her in small things instead. In the careful, slow way he set out the pale reversey stones, which was her manner, and which none of us ever remarked on, because some griefs you honor by leaving them alone. I noticed it every time we played. I never said so. That was my way of saying I care, the same as Tetsuo's primer. It was, in every measurable way, the life I'd wanted. And it lasted about a season before I understood it was over, and it wasn't the enemies who ended it, it was the success. The knocking started with a merchant. Not Takahiro, a new one, from 2 provinces over, who'd heard of the soy sauce and the food and wanted a supply arrangement, a real one. Wagons of soy sauce carried west the way the game was carried everywhere. Reasonable. Good for the village. I helped structure it and it was fine. Then another merchant. Then a minor noble from the next barony, who wanted to know how we'd built the road that paid for itself and would the clever Midorikawa boy consult for a fee on his own miserable roads. Then a letter from a town that wanted to buy the rights to open a Kohara-style eatery under our name. Then the guild Horn's Guild, though not Horn, writing to inquire whether the registered spatial mage Reido Midorikawa might be interested in, at his convenience, when older, discussing his rare discipline with the guild's scholars, terms generous, no obligation. Then a second minor noble, then a third merchant. Then a letter from my grandmother. Warm now, positively affectionate, full of gentle suggestions about my education and the family's future, and how much good a boy with my gifts could do if he were more connected. Every one of them was polite, everyone was reasonable. Everyone wanted a piece of the miracle boy, and they came one after another, and each one landed in the middle of a quiet day I'd fought 7 years to earn, and I finally, sitting at the hearth one evening with a stack of them beside the reversey board, understood the thing the clerk had told me in the white room and I hadn't believed. Quiet's harder to keep than people think. I'd thought he meant, the world will drag you into adventure, monsters, wars, destiny. I'd guarded against that. I'd refused the hero package, taken the convenience gifts, buried myself in the mud, hidden my gift for years, but that wasn't it. The threat to my quiet was never a monster. It was my own competence. Every problem I solved made the village richer and more visible, and richer, more visible things attract people who want things, and I could not solve problems without making things richer and more visible, because that's what solving problems does. My dream of invisibility wasn't just hard to keep, it was structurally impossible. The very thing I was good at, the only thing I'd ever been good at, in either life generated its own opposite. I could be lazy and invisible and let the cellar rot and the children get sick and my father not sleep, or I could fix things and be seen. There was no third door. There had never been a third door. The clerk had known and apologized for the truck and sent me anyway because it was the best he could do and because maybe he'd known I'd rather be the seen version than the version who let the cellar rot. I put the stack of letters down and I looked at the reversey board and I did the hardest recalculation of my second life. My dream of being nobody is dead, I made myself think, plainly, the way I'd think through a spoiled cellar. It died the day I scratched a board in the dirt because I was lonely. It was probably dead before that. I am never going to be invisible. So the question was never whether to be seen. I've been asking the wrong question for 7 years. The question is how to use being seen and for whom. And that reframe, sitting alone at the hearth at 7 years old, was the quiet turning point of my whole life, quieter than the game with Vance, quieter than the ring in the box. Because the moment I stopped fighting to be nobody, I could finally ask the question that mattered. If I'm going to be seen anyway, what's worth being seen for? The answer was already in the house. It was Momo's disasters and Dantaro's sideways stories and Tetsuo's primer and Yuna knocking me into the dirt and my father sleeping easy through the winter for the first time in his life. It was the cellar nobody starved from and the children who didn't get sick. I didn't want to be a great man. I still didn't. Not one bit. But I wanted these people safe and fed and comfortable and free of the fear my father had carried, and I could not give them that from the shadows. The helping and the visibility came in the same package. I'd take the package. Not to rule, not to be important. Just to help, when I could, the people who mattered, and let the world call me whatever it wanted for it. I told my father in my own way that night. He found me still at the hearth, the letters and the board in front of me, and he sat down across from me and set up the stones out of pure habit, slow and careful, her manner, though I don't think he knew he was doing it, and we played a while in silence. He was better now. Years of losing had made him genuinely good, and he beat me sometimes, honestly, which delighted us both. They keep coming, he said finally, moving a stone, meaning the letters, meaning the world. They're going to keep coming, I said, for the rest of our lives. There's no version where they stop, Father. I looked. There isn't one. I flipped a line of his stones, gently. I spent a long time thinking I could keep us small enough to be left alone. I was wrong. Small doesn't get you left alone. Small gets you taken, like Vance tried. The only thing that gets you left alone is being too settled and too useful and too known to be worth moving against. I met his eyes across the board. I'm not going to hide anymore. I'm done hiding. But I'm not going to take any of it, either no titles, no seat in the capital, none of what grandmother wants for me. I'm going to stay right here, in the mud, and help the people I love, and let the world write whatever letters it wants." Goro was quiet for a long moment. Then he did a thing he'd never done. He reached out and put his big scarred hand flat on the reversey board, over the game, stopping it, and looked at me the way he'd looked at me the first night, when I was 4 minutes old, and he'd said, "Look at the lungs on him, he's strong." "When you were born," he said slowly, "I wanted the same thing you wanted, to be nobody. I killed a dragon, and it took everything from me, my friends, my peace, my name. They all belonged to the songs after that, not to me. So I ran to the mud, and I swore my children would never know that. Would grow up small and safe and unfamous and free." His hand pressed on the board. "And I watched you spend 7 years trying to give me the exact thing I ran here to find, hiding your whole self to keep this house quiet." His voice caught just slightly, and my father, the dragon slayer, did not look away from me. "You don't have to protect me from being seen, Rito. I already paid that price. I know what's on the other side of it, and I'm telling you—" He squeezed the board. "It was worth it. The peace I ran to was real. But it was empty until I had you lot to fill it. A quiet house with nobody in it isn't peace. It's just quiet." His eyes went, for half a heartbeat, to the careful arrangement of the pale stones. Her arrangement, and something old and gentle passed over his scarred face. "Your mother knew that better than I did. She's the one who filled it while she was here. You gave me the people, Rito. I'll take the noise that comes with them." I looked at my father, who understood, who had always secretly understood, better than I had, because he'd lived the whole arc I was only now reasoning my way to. That the silent life I'd died wishing for was the empty version. That the thing worth having was never the quiet. It was the crowd of people you'd let the world notice you for. "Okay," I said. My voice wasn't quite steady. "Then we stop hiding. Together." "Together," said Goro, and lifted his hand, and I flipped his whole eastern line, and he laughed the cracked, joyful laugh, and it was the best evening of my second life. Takairo's letter came a week later, and it was the biggest thing anyone had ever proposed to me, and I read it 3 times at the hearth with my heart going like it hadn't since the ring in the box. There was a land across the sea, far a real voyage, weeks of open water to the east, past the edge of the maps in my grandmother's crate. A distant realm called Yamato, wealthy and ancient and mostly cut off, that traded with the mainland only through a handful of brave companies and paid enormously for the right goods. Takairo's company, the Silver Wind, had a foothold there, a small and hard-won one, and Takairo had a proposal that was pure ambition. Take the games, the food, the soy sauce, and above all the mine that made them take me across the sea to Yamato, and open a real trade line between Kohara and a land at the far edge of the world. He needed me, he wrote, with a merchant's flattering honesty, because the goods were only half of it. He needed the boy who dreamed useful dreams to see Yamato with his own eyes and dream what the trade should be. He'd fund it, escort it, risk his own company on it. He asked only that I come. Yamato. I turned the name over, and something about it snagged at the edge of my memory. Some resonance I couldn't place, a shape in the syllables that felt older than this life. A land across the eastern sea, ancient and cut off, that paid dearly for soy sauce and rice and the right kind of mind. "What is it?" Tetsuo asked, watching my face over the primer. "An adventure," I said slowly, and heard how strange the words sounded coming from the boy who'd refused the hero package in a white room 7 years and a whole death ago. The kind I said I never wanted. I looked at the letter, and at my father across the hearth, and at the stack of the world's demands beside the reversey board, and I understood that I'd just told this house I was done hiding, and the world, with its perfect timing, had answered by opening a door to the far side of the sea. I'd stopped fighting to be nobody, so there was really only one thing left to do. I started making a packing list. 4 years is a long time to plan a voyage, and I spent every day of it, because a sea crossing to the far edge of the world is not a thing you rush, and I was, above all else, patient. I was 11 now. The whole voyage, out and back, would fold into a single year of my life. The delay wasn't fear, it was the honest arithmetic of the thing. You do not take a 7-year-old across weeks of open ocean. You wait until he's old enough to survive it. You do not open a trade line to a land you've never seen. You spend years building the goods, the capital, the crew, the ship's worth of soy sauce that keeps on a long voyage. So I'd waited and grown, and in the waiting, the Kohara enterprise had matured from a village boom into a genuine commercial house. The soy sauce shipped to 3 provinces, the games everywhere, the eatery a landmark, the road a proper trade artery. Takairo had grown the Silver Wind alongside us until it could actually afford the voyage it had proposed, and I had grown. That's the part that mattered most for what was coming. At 7, I'd been a clever child who did coin tricks. At 11, I was something else, my mana pool, after 11 years of the ruthless empty sleep repeat method I'd started in a crib, had become genuinely large. Not war mage large. But I could teleport substantial mass, now a full barrel, a person, myself a short distance, and I could sustain it. And I had the spatial sense refined over a decade until I could feel the shape of a whole building, a whole ship, in the dark with my eyes shut. The clerk had called it a convenience. It had stopped being a convenience somewhere around year 9. It was now a genuine capability, and for the first time in my life I'd stopped hiding it. I assembled the party like I assembled everything, by function. Genba, obviously. He'd been coming through Kohara for years, and when he heard the word voyage, his whole huge face lit with the reverse joy, and he simply moved in, appointing himself my bodyguard for a journey to the end of the world with the enthusiasm of a man agreeing to a picnic. Genba didn't understand a tenth of what we were doing. Genba understood that the little lord was going somewhere dangerous, and that he, Genba, was very good at standing between the little lord and danger, and that was all the understanding the job required. I'd never met anyone happier. The escorts I hired properly, on Takairo's advice and Dantaro's vetting, 3 of them, for the parts of the world Genba's cheerful strength couldn't cover. Arisia first, a swordswoman, sharp-edged in every sense, mid-20s, who'd left a city guard post because it bored her, and who conducted herself with a precise competence that reminded me, oddly, of Horn, except that Arisia's precision was earned, and Horn's had been borrowed. She sized me up on the first day exactly the way my grandmother had, and reached a different conclusion, not asset but puzzle, and I liked her immediately. Mort, the veteran. Older, cautious, scarred, the kind of man who'd survived a career of dangerous work by assuming every situation was worse than it looked, and being right often enough to matter. He didn't like the voyage. He said so plainly at the hiring, and then took the job anyway because the pay was good and the caution was exactly what I was paying for. A man who tells you the plan is dangerous before he agrees to it is worth 3 who tell you it'll be fine. And Iruka, the youngest, barely older than Yuna, a ranger, a tracker and hunter and bowman, quiet and watchful and enchanted by everything, who'd never seen the sea and signed on mostly to see it. Iruka was the closest thing the party had to my own younger heart, the one who wanted to go for the going's sake, and I found I needed that on the crew as much as I needed Mort's dread. Yuna came, and that was a fight I lost gladly. 19 now, a real warrior. She'd declared she was coming the moment the voyage was real, and had defended the declaration against our father with such ferocity that Goro, who'd have preferred to keep at least one child on solid ground, had folded. She came as a fighter, a good one, and she came, I think, because she'd spent her whole life watching me be watched, and had decided that if the family's fame was going across the sea, she was going with it as more than decoration. Our grandmother had made a lasting error, dismissing Yuna. I'd made sure Yuna knew it. Tetsuo stayed. He was the eldest. He'd run the house and the enterprise while we were gone, and he was suited to it, and he saw us off at the road with his still reading eyes and made me promise to write everything down, which I did, because someday I'd have to explain Yamato to him, and he'd want the data. The Silver Wind. The ship, named for the company, was a fat-bellied merchant vessel, 3 masts, built for cargo and long hauls, and we loaded her at the coast over a week that taught me more about my own magic than the previous 4 years combined. Because cargo, it turned out, was a spatial mage's paradise. A merchant ship's hold is a nightmare of stowage. Everything must be packed tight, balanced, secured against the roll, accessible in the right order, and it's done by sweating men with block and tackle over days, and it's never done as well as it should be because human hands and human backs have limits. I had no such limits. I could feel the shape of the whole hold in my spatial sense, every barrel and crate and coil of rope, and I could move mass without touching it, and I spent that loading week doing what no ship's master had ever seen. I stowed the hold perfectly. Every barrel of soy sauce nested into its ideal place, the weight distributed exactly for trim, the load lashed and balanced better than a lifetime crew could manage, and I did it in a day and a half. The ship's master, a weathered man named Kesk who'd been dubious about carrying a child, watched me settle the last row of casks into a stow he'd have sworn was impossible, and revised his entire opinion of the voyage. "I've hauled cargo 40 years, he said. Never seen a hold sit like that." From Kesk, that was Horn signing the registration all over again, a doubter converted not by argument but by a thing he couldn't explain. We sailed on a fair wind, and for the first 10 days I learned to be useful on the water, and the party learned to be a party. Arisia and Mort circled each other's competence and settled into a wary professional respect. Iruka was seasick for 4 days, and then never again, and spent the rest of the voyage at the bow like a figurehead, drinking in the empty ocean with an expression of pure enchantment that made even Mort soften. Genba was, improbably, a natural sailor, enormous strength, no fear of heights, cheerfully hauling on lines that took two ordinary men, though he could not for the life of him grasp why the ship went where the wind didn't, and asked about it daily. Una trained every morning on the pitching deck to keep her sea legs, and she'd improved so much that the ship's crew gathered to watch, and she caught my eye across the deck with that look, and I understood she'd finally found the thing she'd wanted her whole life, to be watched for what she was, and not in my shadow. She'd earned it herself. I hadn't done that for her. I'd only once drawn a diagram in the dirt. I used the spatial magic constantly, and openly, and it was such a relief I could have wept. A snapped line I could rereave by teleporting the rope through the block. Cargo that shifted in a swell I could resecure without sending men into a dangerous hold. Fresh water, the great limiter of any long voyage, I could manage precisely, moving it from the deep casks as needed with no spillage and no waste, which stretched our supply and eased Mort's dread by a measurable margin. I'd spent 11 years hiding this, and now I stood on the open sea using it in front of a whole crew who thought it was the most wonderful thing they'd ever sailed with, and the clerk's word convenience echoed at me, and I finally understood he'd undersold it on purpose, or maybe just hadn't known what a determined man does with 11 years and a growth method. The storm came on the 16th day, and it was the thing Mort had dreaded, and the thing I'd secretly needed, because it proved to me and to everyone what I'd become. It came fast, the way sea storms do, the sky going from fair to bruised in an afternoon, the swells building until the fat-bellied silver wind was climbing hills of water and sliding down their backs into troughs that hid the horizon. Kesk and his crew were good. They'd struck sail and battened down and were running before it with the skill of men who'd survived this before. But there's a limit to skill against a sea that means it, and around the worst of the night we hit that limit. Two things went wrong at once, the way they do. A cask broke loose in the hold, a big one, a full water cask, 300 pounds of it, torn free of a lashing by the roll and now smashing back and forth across the hold with every pitch, staving in other casks, threatening to hold the hull from inside, and no man could go down into that black pitching space to stop a loose cask without being killed by it. And at nearly the same moment, a following sea broke over the stern and flooded down into the hold through a hatch that hadn't sealed clean, hundreds of gallons of seawater pouring in, and a merchant ship's hold full of loose water in a storm is how ships die. The free surface of it slams from side to side, killing the vessel's balance, dragging her over. Kesk's face, lit by the swinging lamp, was the face of a man doing the arithmetic of his own death. "We can't get below," he shouted over the wind. "Cask'll kill anyone who tries, and the water's rising faster than we can. We're going to have to—" "Nobody goes below," I said. And I planted my feet, and I reached out with the spatial sense into the black flooded hold I couldn't see, the sense that had mapped every cask when I stowed it, and I found the loose cask by its shape careening through the dark. I teleported it onto the deck. 300 pounds of water cask, out of the killing black of the hold, and onto the streaming deck at Genba's feet, and Genba, bless him, bless his uncomprehending strength, simply grabbed it and held it, roaring with delight even in the storm, because the little lord had done a wonderful thing, and Genba's job was to hold what needed holding. Then the water, the seawater sloshing in the hold, the free surface trying to kill us. I couldn't teleport water like a solid object as easily. It's diffuse, it fights the sense, but I'd managed the freshwater casks all voyage, and I'd learned water's stubbornness, and I reached into the flooded hold and moved it in great heaving masses, up and over the rail, back into the sea it came from, load after load. I didn't throw all of it, only enough to bring the ship's balance back, only enough to kill the free surface that was trying to roll us. It emptied me 11 years of pool, poured out into that black night, the gray creeping into the edges of my vision, the way it had the very first time with a pebble in a crib. But I stayed conscious, barely, swaying, and I got the balance back, and I got the failed hatch sealed by teleporting a spare grating and canvas into its throat from where it lay. And the silver wind, her balance restored, rode up the next great hill of water and down the far side, and lived. I sat down hard on the streaming deck when it was done, wrung out completely, and Arisia caught me before I hit it, and I looked up into the faces of the crew, Kesk, Mort, the sailors, all of them staring at the 11-year-old boy who just saved the ship with something none of them had a name for, and I saw the thing I'd hidden from my whole life, out in the open, and it didn't frighten me anymore. "That's not a convenience," Mort said, very quietly, into the wind. The cautious veteran who'd told me the plan was dangerous before he took the job. "That's not a parlor trick. Boy, what are you?" Tired, I said honestly, and passed out in Arisia's arms. I woke a full day later, the pool refilling slow and sore, the storm long behind us, the sea gone glassy and enormous and calm. Iruka was at the bow again. Yuna sat beside my bunk, and she didn't say anything clever, she just gripped my hand once, hard, which was Yuna for don't do that again, and I'm proud of you at the same time. Gemba had told the whole crew the story of the cask 9 times, and it grew each telling. I'd been a child hiding tricks. I'd spent a decade as the boy who palmed coins for carters, who let a guild master call him a fraud, who did the impossible only where it looked like a joke. And in one storm I'd stopped being that entirely, and become the other thing, not a marvel, not a monster. Just a genuine and undeniable asset, a member of a crew who'd pulled his full weight and then some when the sea meant to kill them all. It was the parody the plan had always been climbing toward, made real in a single night. I was no longer the underestimated boy from the mud. I was Rado, who saved the Silver Wind, and every soul aboard knew it, and I let them, and it was fine. It was better than fine. On the 24th day, Iruka called out from the bow in a voice I'd never heard from him, not enchanted this time, but shaken. Land. We crowded to the rail. And there, low on the eastern horizon under a rising sun, was the coast of Yamato green mountains falling to the sea, terraced hillsides, and, as we drew closer through the morning, the shapes of buildings along the shore, roofed in a way I knew, curved and tiled, and a torii gate standing red against the water where a shrine faced the sea, and fishing boats with a hull line I recognized in my bones, and the whole shape of a coast that no one on that ship had ever seen and that reached into the oldest part of me and closed a fist around my heart. I gripped the rail. I couldn't breathe. Because it wasn't just land. It wasn't just the trade venture's destination or the far edge of the map. It was home. Not this life's home, the other one. The one the salaryman had died wishing for, on a crosswalk, under a truck, 11 years and a whole world ago. The village, the shape of it, the roofs and the gate and the mountains and the boats. "Rito?" Yuna said beside me, seeing my face. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said, and my voice came out strange, thick, the voice of a boy and a dead man at once, staring at a coastline he'd never seen and had somehow always been trying to get back to. "It's just I think I've been here before." The silver wind came about for the harbor, and the land that looked like home rose up green and impossible before us, and I let it, and I did not look away. I stepped off the silver wind onto the dock at the port town of Minato, and I nearly fell to my knees, and it wasn't the sea legs. It was the smell. Cut wood and salt, and underneath cooking rice and grilling fish and soy sauce, real soy sauce, everywhere, in the air the way it had been in the air of my grandmother's village when I was small enough to be carried. And I hadn't smelled it in 2 lives, and I smelled it now on a dock at the edge of the world, and I had to stop and breathe and let it take me apart for a moment before I could put myself back together. Yamato was Japan, not the Japan of the office and the truck and the crosswalk. Older, a pseudo-medieval Japan the way Midfield was a pseudo-medieval Europe, a fantasy version, wooden and tiled and lantern-lit, with samurai instead of salarymen and daimyo instead of CEOs. But the bones of it were the home I'd died reaching for. Kimono in the streets, indigo and gray. Katana at the hips of the warriors, worn edge up in a way my hands remembered though I'd never held one. Tatami on the floors of the inn Takairo's contacts had arranged, the specific gaive of it underfoot, the smell of new rush matting. A public bath and onsen fed from a hot spring up the hill steaming behind a Norin curtain. Rice as the center of every meal instead of the exotic garnish it was in Kohara. Chopsticks, miso, pickled plum. A whole civilization built around the exact tastes and shapes and rhythms the salaryman had spent his short, sad life too busy to go home to. I was the only person in the party who wasn't lost. That was the strange, dizzy gift of it. My companions were in a foreign land at the end of the world, and I was a ghost walking through my own childhood. The culture shock hit the party like the storm had hit the ship, and it was, I'll be honest, the most fun I'd had in either life. Genba and the chopsticks were an epic. We sat down to our first proper meal. A low table, cushions, bowls of rice and grilled fish and vegetables in the dark savory sauce that made Arisia's eyes go wide, and Genba was handed a pair of chopsticks and stared at them with the exact expression of a man handed a lock-picking kit and told to perform surgery. He tried to spear the fish, he tried to shovel. He tried, at one desperate point, to use them as a single implement, like a tiny spear, and got a grain of rice and celebrated like he'd won a war. The inn staff, too polite to laugh, developed a facial tremor from suppressing it. I taught him, patiently, the way Tetsuo had taught me letters, and Genba's face when he finally finally lifted a piece of fish cleanly to his mouth was the reversey joy, the pure uncomplicated triumph, and the whole table cheered, and the innkeeper brought him a second helping for free out of sheer affection. Genba conquered chopsticks the way he conquered everything, badly, joyfully, and eventually. Arisia in the bath was a disaster of a different order. She'd gone to the onsen expecting, I gathered, some private arrangement, and discovered the reality of a communal bath that you washed, and then you soaked, together, in the open, with strangers, and came storming back to the inn scarlet to the ears and speechless with a scandalized fury that took 3 of us to calm. They all just together, she managed, and could not finish. Mort, who found the whole thing hilarious, said dryly that it was the cleanest he'd ever seen her and she nearly drew on him. It took Iruka of all people to bring her around Iruka, who'd taken to the bath instantly, who'd taken to everything instantly, and who explained with a young ranger's practical wonder that it was just how you got clean here, and that the water was the best thing he'd ever felt, and that she should really try it and stop being strange about it. She tried it. She never admitted she liked it. She went every single day for the rest of our stay. That's Arisia admitting she liked it. Iruka was enchanted by the whole land the way he'd been enchanted by the empty ocean, and it was the sweetest thing to watch the young ranger going wide-eyed at the fletching of Yamato arrows, at the way a carpenter joined wood without a single nail, at the paper lanterns and the gardens raked into patterns and the swordsmith's forge glowing up the hill. He asked to stay behind at every stop. He wanted to learn everything. He reminded me so much of the part of myself I'd killed to be a salaryman, the part that wanted to go and see and make that. I resolved privately that whatever else this venture did, Iruka was going to get to learn some Yamato craft before we left, because somebody should get to want a thing purely, and then get it. And Yuna trained with a Yamato sword, that was the one that mattered. Because Yamato's warriors were, plainly, extraordinary, a whole different tradition of the blade, edge-up, two-handed, precise and lethal in ways the mainland's hacking styles weren't, and Yuna, who had spent her entire life wanting to be strong, saw it and wanted it with the old hunger. The hunger I'd watched split logs when she was 12. And a local swordmaster, watching this foreign girl on the practice ground, saw the patience in her footwork, the patience I'd once drawn in the dirt behind a soy shed, and offered, over the weeks of our stay, to teach her a little. She soaked it up. She'd found at the far edge of the world the thing she'd been reaching for, and I got to watch her find it, and I said nothing about diagrams because it wasn't my triumph. It was hers, and she'd earned every piece of it, and the old ache of having stolen her spotlight finally, completely healed watching her stand on a Yamato practice ground being watched by masters for what she was. My own cover deepened without my doing anything but be myself, which was the strangest part. Because I understood Yamato, effortlessly from the inside, in a way that should have been impossible for a mainland boy who'd never left his province before the voyage. I knew how to bow the depth of it, the timing, when a deeper bow was courtesy and when it was mockery. I knew which foot crossed a threshold and which didn't. I knew not to stab my chopsticks upright in the rice, not to pass food chopstick to chopstick, not to pour my own cup at a formal table. I knew the difference between the words you used with a merchant and the words you used with a samurai. I knew, and this undid a tea-house proprietor entirely the correct, precise ritual of receiving a cup of tea, turning the bowl, the whole grammar of it that no foreigner could possibly have. Takairo's contacts, and then the townsfolk, and then the local officials, reached the only explanation available to them, which was the one I'd been cultivating my whole life. The boy simply understands things. The clever Midorikawa boy, the prodigy from across the sea, who grasped Yamato customs faster and truer than travelers who'd lived here for years, who spoke to a land as if he'd been born to it. It wasn't magic, my spatial gift was known and registered, and beside the point. It was just understanding, uncanny and total, and it earned me goodwill everywhere I went, doors opening, prices softening, a foreign 11-year-old treated with a respect that baffled my own party, and that I accepted with the practiced smallness of a boy who'd spent 11 years learning to be underestimated in exactly the right direction. I turned it to the trade, of course, that's why we'd come, and I never lost sight of it even walking through my own ghost of a homeland. I saw, with the double vision of a man who'd lived here, and an engineer who calculated everything, exactly what the trade should be, not what Takaido had guessed. Takaido had thought to sell Yamato mainland goods. But Yamato wanted almost nothing from the mainland. It was ancient and self-sufficient and slightly contemptuous of the crude world across the sea. What it wanted, what the wealthy houses would pay enormously for, was novelty that flattered its own tastes. The games. Reversi and shogi, which Yamato took to instantly and completely, because a land that had refined the tea ceremony into an art form was exactly the audience for a game of pure, elegant strategy. And what the mainland wanted, desperately, without knowing it yet, was flowing back the other way. The soy sauce done Yamato proper, the rice varieties, the craft goods, the whole savory, refined cuisine I'd been reconstructing from memory in a mud village and could now source at the root. I redesigned the whole venture in my head over those weeks, standing in tea houses and on docks and in the steam of the onsen, and it was 10 times what Takero had proposed, and I knew it would work, because I knew both shores from the inside in a way no merchant on earth could. The audience came because the fame preceded me, and that surprised even me. I'd expected, if anyone official noticed us, that it would be trouble that a foreign boy who did the impossible, and understood too much, would draw the suspicion I'd drawn from Horn. But Yamato's fame traveled through the same channels the mainlands had, and it traveled faster, because a self-satisfied ancient land loves a good story about a foreign prodigy who honors its ways, and Takero's contacts had been telling exactly that story in exactly the right ears. The boy from across the sea who bowed like a native, who understood the tea, who'd saved a ship with a magic no Yamato mage practiced, who'd brought the elegant game the daimyo's courts couldn't stop playing. Word of it climbed over the weeks from the port town of Minato up the coast and inland to the seat of the province, and it reached the innkeeper delivered the letter himself, ashen with the honor of it the regional governor. The daimyo of the province, a man named Tadakatsu, who administered this whole stretch of coast and mountain in the name of a distant capital I'd never see, and who had heard of the foreign miracle boy and, rather than suspecting him, was curious about him. The letter was an invitation to an audience, not a summons. An invitation which in Yamato I knew from the inside, from the old life, was the far greater honor and the far more dangerous thing, because a summons you could survive by obeying and an invitation you could only survive by impressing. Governor Tadakatsu requested the pleasure of the company of Reito Midorikawa of Kohara and his party at the provincial seat. Mort read the room and hated it. "A lord wants to look at you," he said, in the cautious veteran's flat way. "Lords who want to look at valuable foreign things don't always let them leave." He wasn't wrong. It was my grandmother all over again, the assessing eye of power measuring a valuable thing for use and threat, except this power had an army and a province, and I was a foreigner at the far edge of the world with a single merchant ship and no house behind me but a mud barony weeks across a killing sea. But I'd stopped being afraid of the assessing eye somewhere between the storm and the smell of soy sauce on the Minato dock. I knew what I was now. Not a child hiding tricks, not a boy who let Horn call him a fraud to stay safe. I was Rito, who'd saved the Silver Wind, who understood 2 worlds from the inside, who'd outthought an old house and a guildmaster and a scheming noble before he was 8, and I was going to walk into a Yamato governor's hall and be, for the first time in either life, exactly and openly what I was, because I was done being anything else. "He doesn't want to trap me," I said, and I was fairly sure I was right, because I understood Tadakatsu's kind the way I understood the tea. "He wants to be impressed. Powerful men who invite instead of summon are collectors. He's heard there's a wonder from across the sea and he wants to see it with his own eyes and decide for himself what it is." I folded the letter. "So we let him see, and we let him decide. And we make very sure that what he decides is this one is worth trading with, not this one is worth keeping. And if he decides wrong?" Mort asked. Genba, cleaning a piece of fish off his newly mastered chopsticks, looked up cheerfully. "Then he finds out why they call the little lord's dad the Dragon Slayer," he said. "Except it's the little lord's friend Genba instead, and there's no dragon, just me." He beamed. "I'm very good at that part." Arisia snorted, Iruka laughed, even Mort's mouth twitched. And I looked around at them, the swordswoman scandalized daily and going back to the bath anyway, the veteran naming the danger before he walked into it, the young ranger enchanted by a nailless joint, the giant who'd conquered chopsticks and would happily stand between me and an army, my sister who'd found her whole life's hunger fed on a foreign practice ground, and I felt the specific warmth I'd only ever felt at the Kohara hearth, the warmth my father had named for me. Not the empty quiet, but the crowd of people you'd let the world notice you for. We went to the audience. The provincial seat was inland, a day's travel up a river valley terraced with rice paddies so green they hurt to look at, and the governor's residence sat above the town, not a European castle but a Yamato one, white walls and dark tile and curving eaves, elegant and severe and completely achingly familiar. I walked up to it through the smell of rice and cut wood and cook smoke, through my own childhood, through the home the salarymen had died reaching for, to meet the most powerful man I'd ever face, and I was not afraid. Governor Tadakatsu received us in a room open to a garden. The paper screen slid back, a mountain framed in the doorway like a painting. He was older, gray at the temples, dignified in the plain, expensive way of real power, and his eyes, when they found me, did exactly what I'd predicted: assessed, measured, and then, because I bowed correctly and turned the tea bowl right and spoke to him in the register a boy uses to a lord, and not a beat wrong in any of it, softened into something that was not quite belief. They told me a foreign child understood our ways as if born to them, he said, in a low, even voice, studying me across the tatami. I did not believe it. Boys from across the sea do not know how to receive tea. He set down his own bowl. You do. You understand things you have no way to understand, and you did a thing on the water no mage in my province can do, and you brought a game my whole court has stopped sleeping to play. A pause, the pause of a man deciding how to place a piece on a board. I did not invite you here to trade, Redo Midorikawa. I invited you because I have a problem, and I have run out of men who can solve it, and I only wonder whether a boy who understands things he shouldn't might understand this too. And there it was. Not a trap, not my grandmother's grab. Something I hadn't planned for at all, walking through my own ghost of home. A problem, laid at my feet by a man with a whole province behind him, and no more ideas. Tell me the problem, I said, and I'll tell you if I can help. Tadakatsu almost smiled, and then he told me about the salt. The salt problem was killing a village, and Tadakatsu described it the way a man describes a thing he's ashamed he can't fix. Down the coast, a day south of Minato, there was a fishing village called Shiohama that made salt the old way, seawater flooded into shallow clay-lined ponds, evaporated by sun and wind over days into thick brine, then boiled down over fires into clean salt. It was the village's whole living, salt from the sea, patient and reliable, the same way it had been made for centuries, 300 souls give or take. A place, I understood the moment he said it, exactly the size and shape of Kohara, and the salt was turning bad. Slowly, over the past 2 years, the brine coming out of the ponds tainted, discolored, and the salt boiled from it fouled with something that made it unsellable and, if you used it anyway, made you sick. The taint had started in the ponds nearest the western end of the flats and crept, pond by pond, season by season, eastward across the works. Half the village's ponds were dead now, the other half were failing. In a year, maybe 2, Shiohama would have no living at all, and 300 people would have to leave the only place they knew, and Tadakatsu, who was responsible for them, could not stop it. My mages call it a curse, he said, and the contempt in the word told me everything about why the mages had failed. A creeping corruption, a malevolence in the earth. They have tried to fight it purification rites. Wards, one of them wanted to burn the western ponds and salt the ground, which struck me as a poor way to help a place already dying of bad salt. His jaw tightened. They treat it as an enemy, a thing to be beaten. And it does not beat. It creeps east, and my mages perform their rites, and the salt keeps turning bad, and I have run out of mages. I listened, and I felt the two halves of me locked together the way they did, the way they had over the spoiled cellar 16 years ago, the engineer and the man who couldn't look away from a place the size and shape of home. Because I could already hear the mistake. It was the same mistake Horn had made, the same mistake my grandmother made about Yuna, the same mistake Vance made about the rights. Everyone in this story kept losing to me for the identical reason. They took the reed that fit their world instead of the reed that fit the facts. Tadakatsu's mages were warriors of a kind. They saw a bad thing spreading, and they reached for the only frame they had: enemy, curse, fight, and they threw rights at it the way Yuna had once thrown her whole weight into a lunge, committing to a battle against a thing that wasn't fighting back, because it wasn't an enemy at all. It's not a curse, I said. Tadakatsu went still. I don't know what it is yet, but I know what it isn't. A curse doesn't creep east one pond at a time on a schedule. A curse doesn't start at the western end and move the direction. Which way does the groundwater run under those flats, Governor? Which way does the land slope underneath? He blinked. It was, plainly, not a question anyone had asked him. West is higher, he said slowly. The hills are to the west. The flats slope down to the sea, east. So water underground moves west to east, downhill, toward the sea. I could see it now, the shape of it, drawn clean the way the reversi board drew clean. And the taint moves west to east, with the water. That's not a malevolence choosing its victims, Governor. That's not an enemy advancing. That's a leak. Something is leaking bad water into the ground at the western end, up in the high ground, and the groundwater is carrying it downhill through the flats, one pond at a time, in the exact order the water reaches them. I met his eyes. Your mages have been fighting a war against a broken pipe. There was a silence in the room open to the garden. Tadakatsu looked at me, an 11-year-old foreign boy who'd been in his province 3 weeks, and I watched him do the thing Kesk had done watching me stow the hold. The thing my father had done at the reversi board. The thing everyone eventually did. Revise, all at once, his entire estimate of what he was dealing with. No one, he said very quietly, has ever described it to me that way. In 2 years. No one described it that way because everyone who looked at it was a mage, I said. And a mage sees magic, so a mage sees a curse. I'm not a mage, which was almost true, and true enough. I'm just someone who thinks about how water moves. May I go and look? I can't fix a thing I haven't diagnosed. But if I'm right, if it's a leak and not a curse, then it can be found, and a thing that can be found can be fixed, and your village doesn't have to die and you don't have to burn anyone's pawns. Why? Tadakatsu asked, and it was a real question. The ruler's question, the one my grandmother had really been asking all those years ago. You came to trade. This is not your village. These are not your people. You could sail home with your soy sauce and your games and be a rich boy. Why do you want to fix my salt? And I told him the truth, which I'd learned at 7 years old at a hearth with my father, and which I'd finally stopped being ashamed of. Because it's the size of home, I said. And I can't look away from a place the size of home that's dying when I know I might be able to help. I stopped being able to a long time ago. Believe me, Governor, I've tried. We went to Shiohama the next morning, and I made the choice on the walk down the coast road that I want to mark, because it was the first time in my whole second life I chose to intervene openly, as myself, in a stranger's crisis, for no reason but that I could. Every fix before this had been slantwise. The cellar, the well, the eatery I'd hidden inside other people's credit. Even the storm had been reaction, a thing forced on me. This was different. Nobody made me walk down that road. I was choosing to spend my magic and my mind and my time on a fishing village at the edge of the world because I couldn't stand to watch it die, and I was going to do it out loud and let Tadakatsu and his mages and the whole province see exactly who did it. The boy who'd sworn to be nobody, walking into a stranger's dying village to help in his own name. The clerk would have laughed. Quiet's harder to keep than people think. I'd stopped trying to keep it. It felt, walking down that road in the sea wind with Genba beside me, like taking off a coat I'd worn for 11 years without noticing how heavy it was. Genba came because Genba always came, and because a village that was dying might have desperate people in it, and Mort had insisted on muscle. Iruka came too, quiet and watchful, to read the land I wanted a tracker's eyes on the terrain even more than a mage's. Yuna stayed with Arisia to guard Takayaro and the ship. The venture didn't stop just because I'd found a village to save. Shiohama was heartbreaking. The eastern pond still worked. You could see the good salt drying white and clean, men and women raking it, but the western half of the flats was a ruin, the ponds discolored, a faint wrong smell over them, an ochre stain in the clay, and the people who worked the failing edge did it with the flat, exhausted faces of people watching their living end and being told by robed men that a curse was to blame and that the rites would work eventually. They'd stopped believing the rites. You could see it. They just had nothing else. I walked the flats from east to west, from the good ponds toward the dead ones, following the taint upstream toward its source, the way you trace a bad smell to the thing that's rotting. And the taint got worse as I climbed the gentle slope westward, exactly as it should if I was right, the discoloration deepening, the ochre stain darkening, until at the highest, westernmost edge of the works, up against the foot of the hills, I reached the source region, the place where the bad water was entering the ground before the slope carried it down and east through everything below. There was no broken pipe, of course. This was a fantasy world, and the leak wasn't plumbing. But there was, at the base of the western hills above the flats, a spring, an old spring the villagers had always used, sweet water once that fed a stream down past the works, and the spring, when I crouched over it and dipped a hand in it, was faintly, wrongly warm, and the water coming out of it had the same ochre taint in it. I wiped my hand off on the grass at once. The skin prickled faintly where the water had touched it, and I filed that away as one more piece of evidence. One more reason not to linger over it. There was, under the smell of the sea, a smell I knew from a very deep place, a smell like a struck flint, an old stone, and something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Iruka crouched beside me, reading the ground the way I read a board. The spring's flow is up, he said quietly. Look at the channel, old high water lines here, but it's running higher now, and it wasn't. Something's pushing more water through it than there used to be. And there, he pointed at the stone around the spring's mouth, at a hairline in the rock face above it, weeping, faint ochre. It's not just the spring. It's coming out of the rock, behind the rock. There's more water back there than the mountain should hold, and it's finding every crack to get out. Which means, I said slowly, feeling the shape of it lock in. The source isn't the spring. The spring's just one of the leaks. The source is inside the hill. Something in there is fouling the water and slowly forcing more of it out, and the mages have been standing down on the flats doing rites at the symptom, a day's walk from the actual cause, because the cause is underground, where none of them thought to look because you don't fight a curse by digging a hole. My spatial sense, I'd been reaching into the hill with it since I got close. The way I'd mapped the ship's hold. The way I'd found the cellar's wet corner as a baby, my spatial sense was giving me something it had never given me before. A wrongness. A shape, deep in the hill behind the weeping rock, that wasn't stone and wasn't water, a hollow, a chamber, and in the chamber a density, a mass, a something that hummed against my perception, the way a bad tooth hums against your tongue. Whatever was fouling the water was in there, and it was leaking, and the leaking was getting worse, the way a slow leak always gets worse. I stood up and my hands weren't quite steady, and it wasn't the diagnosis anymore. Governor's mages wanted to burn the ponds and fight the curse, I said. If any of them had ever wanted to destroy the source, if they'd found this, and done to it what they do to everything, thrown force at it. I looked at Iruka, at the weeping rock, at the ochre spring running down toward 300 people's dying living. There's something in the hill, Iruka, something old, something that's already leaking and getting worse on its own. And every instinct these people have is to attack it, to break it, to fight it. The old cold understanding, the engineer's dread. But if that source is what I think it is, a made thing, a reservoir of something, cracked and slowly failing, then the very last thing you ever do to a cracked vessel under pressure is hit it. Iruka looked at the hairline crack weeping its faint poison into the water. He was young, but he was a hunter, and a hunter understands a wounded thing that will kill you worse if you corner it. Break it wrong, he said, and instead of a slow leak, you get all of it at once, I said. Whatever's been trickling out for 2 years, poisoning half a salt works, you get it all in an afternoon, into the spring, into the groundwater, into the sea. I thought of 300 people the size and shape of home. You don't get a dying village. You get a dead one, and dead water for miles, and it happens the moment some mage decides to be a hero and destroy the curse. We stood at the weeping rock in the sea wind, and above and behind it the hill held its old bad secret, and I understood that I hadn't just diagnosed a problem. I diagnosed a bomb with a slow fuse, and I'd arrived at the exact moment before someone tried to cut the fuse by hitting it with a hammer. I sent word up to Tadakatsu that evening, plainly, no flattery. It is not a curse. It is a source in the western hill, an old-made thing that is cracked and leaking into the groundwater, which carries the poison down through your salt works. Your mages have been treating the symptom a day from the cause. Do not under any circumstance let anyone try to destroy the source. It is under pressure. Destroying it will release everything at once and kill Shiohama and the sea around it in a day. I need to go inside the hill and see the thing itself before I can tell you how to stop the leak safely. I am going tomorrow. Genba read it over my shoulder. Over the years on the road, I'd shown him his letters now and then, and he'd learned them slowly and proudly, the same way he'd later conquer chopsticks, and he made out half of it himself and asked me the rest and frowned. You're going in the hill, he said. In the ground, where the bad thing is. Somebody has to look at it, I said. And I'm the only one who can feel its shape from outside, and I'm the only one who won't try to fight it. Genba considered this with the total seriousness he brought to the 2 or 3 things he understood completely. Then he picked up his enormous sword, the one that had held a 300-pound cask steady in a storm, and set it across his knees, and settled in beside the door of the room where I'd sleep, facing out. Then I go in the hill with you, he said. You feel the shape. I hold what needs holding, same as the boat. He beamed. The reverse joy. The pure, uncomplicated thing. I'm very good at the holding part. I looked at my friend the giant who'd lost to a 4-year-old at a game and loved him for it ever since, who'd crossed the killing sea for no reason but that I was crossing it, who'd walk into a poisoned hill because the little lord was walking into it and holding was his job. Yeah, I said, and my throat was tight. Same as the boat. We go together. Outside, down the slope, the western pond sat dead and ochre in the last light, and the sweet-turned-wrong spring ran its slow poison toward the sea, and somewhere deep in the hill, an old broken thing leaked a little worse than it had the day before. In the morning, we'd go find out what it was. We got into the hill through the spring's own channel because I didn't dare dig. Digging was force. Digging meant picks and shattered rock and vibration traveling into a chamber holding something cracked and under pressure, and I'd spent the whole night lying awake mapping the hill with my spatial sense the way I'd once mapped the cottage from my crib, feeling out every fault and hollow, and I'd found a way in that didn't require breaking anything. The spring channel ran back into the rock along a natural fissure, the same fissure the bad water was using to escape, and it widened, a body's length into a crawlable void that led, my sense told me, down and back toward the chamber. Tight, wet, bad-smelling, but whole, a path that already existed, that I could travel without striking a single blow against the mountain. Genba could not fit through the fissure. This was a problem I'd known about and dreaded, because Genba's whole conception of his job was going where I went, and the fissure was sized for an 11-year-old and a slim ranger at most. "I go first, I make it bigger," Genba said, hefting his sword, and I put my hand flat on his chest, which on Genba was like putting your hand on a wall. "No," I said. "Genba, listen to me. This is the most important holding you've ever done, and you do it out here. If you swing that sword at this rock, the whole hill feels it, and the thing inside might break, and then I die in there, and so does the village. The most dangerous thing in the world right now is force. You are the strongest person I know. Which means you're the most dangerous person I could bring inside." I held his eyes. "So you hold the outside. Nothing gets in the fissure behind me. Nobody follows, nobody helps, nobody panics and comes digging. You keep the way clear and you keep it still. Can you do that?" Genba's face worked through it slowly, and I watched him understand, in his own complete way, that being asked not to swing the sword was a harder and more trusting job than being asked to swing it. He planted himself at the fissure mouth like a mountain guarding a mountain. Before I went, he unhooked his water flask from his belt and pressed it into my hands without a word. Genba's whole understanding of the hours ahead, distilled into the one thing he could give me. "Nothing gets in," he said. "It stays still. I hold the still." He nodded gravely, the reverse joy for once entirely absent, replaced by something steadier. "Go feel the shape, little lord. I've got the still." Iruka came in behind me, because I needed a second set of eyes I trusted, and because a ranger moves through tight dark places better than anyone, and because I flatly could not do the thing I was about to do alone. Mort had wanted to come and I'd refused him. Mort was caution, and caution's place was managing the retreat, holding the plan together outside where he could see all of it. Everyone in their function. I'd built the party this way on purpose, 4 years ago, without knowing I was building it for a poisoned hole in the ground at the edge of the world. We went in. The crawl was the worst physical thing I'd done in this life, worse than the storm, worse than emptying my whole mana into the sea. Wet stone, close air gone thick and wrong-smelling, the ochre taint of the water strong enough now to sting the eyes and catch the throat, and I made Iruka tie a wet cloth over his face and did the same, because whatever was fouling the water was fouling the air of that passage too, and neither of us could afford to breathe much of it. But there was air moving, that was the thing that saved us, and I felt it the moment we were in. The fissure drew, a slow, steady pull of air out toward the spring mouth, because the source deep in the hill was warm, and warm things breathe, and its breathing carried the worst of the taint out past us and away rather than letting it pool. The wet cloth was for the dregs, the draft was for the rest. We went slow, we went careful. I felt every handspan ahead with the spatial sense before I trusted my weight to it, and twice I moved a loose stone out of our path not by prying it. Prying is force, but by teleporting it gently aside, the way I'd once teleported a pebble across a crib, 16 years and a whole ocean ago. And then the passage opened, and we were in the chamber, and I saw the thing. It was not natural. That was the first and worst fact, hitting me the instant Iruka's small shielded lantern threw light across it. The chamber was carved old, impossibly old, the walls cut with worn geometric channels that had once meant something and now meant nothing anyone alive could read. And in the center of the chamber, on a dais cut from the living rock, sat the artifact. I don't have a good word for it, because it wasn't a thing from either of my worlds. A construct metal that wasn't quite metal, dark and seamless, shaped into a vessel the height of a man, ringed with the same worn channels as the walls, and inside it, visible through cracks that spidered across its surface, a light. A slow, sick ochre light, pulsing faintly, the exact color of the poison in the spring, and where the cracks ran the light seeped a thin weeping of luminous corruption that ran down the vessel's sides and pooled and soaked into the rock of the dais, and, I understood, from there into the groundwater, and from there down through the hill and out through the spring and into the salt ponds and the bodies of 300 people the size and shape of home. A made thing. A vessel of a lost civilization, holding something I'd never know what, some power, some substance, some captured force the channels had once contained and directed and cracked. Slowly failing. Leaking for 2 years, and the cracks I could see were worse than old. Some of them were fresh, spreading, the vessel losing integrity a little more each season under the pressure of whatever it held. And the chamber was warm. That was the source of the draft, the reason the fisher breathed a low wrong heat radiating from the vessel, the heat that had turned the spring warm a day's crawl away. Iruka made a low sound behind his cloth. The mages, he whispered. If they'd found this, they'd have blasted it, I said. My voice came out flat with the horror of the near miss. Every instinct they have, a source of corruption, a cursed vessel, you destroy it, you shatter it, you cleanse the site, and the moment they cracked it open, I reached out with the spatial sense and felt the pressure inside the vessel, the way I'd felt the storm cask careening in the black hold, and it took everything I had not to recoil. It was full. Not leaking empty, not a dying trickle, the vessel was still full, holding a vast reservoir of the ochre force under enormous pressure, and the 2 years of leaking had barely tapped it. The leak was a pinhole in a dam. Shatter the vessel and you didn't release a trickle. You released everything, all at once, all that pressure and all that poison venting into the groundwater in an afternoon. Tadakatsu's mages, in their instinct to fight, had been 3 careful decisions away from murdering the entire village and poisoning the coast for a generation. And they'd have died calling it heroism. I sat down on the wet floor of that chamber, an arm's length from a leaking vessel of a dead civilization, and I did the thing I did, the only thing I'd ever really been good at in either life. I stopped seeing an enemy and started seeing a system. It's not a monster, I told myself, the way I'd told Tadakatsu. It's not a curse. It's a broken vessel under pressure with a slow leak. Reframe it. What is this problem, actually? It was a plumbing problem, a containment problem. In my old world, you didn't fix a cracked pressurized vessel by destroying it, and you didn't fix it by patching the cracks either, because a full vessel of failing integrity will just crack somewhere else. You relieve the pressure. You give the contents somewhere else to go, somewhere controlled, somewhere harmless, and you drain it slowly, so the vessel de-stresses instead of blowing. You shunt it. But I couldn't drain the ochre force into the sea, or the groundwater, or anywhere it could reach living things. That was the whole poison. I needed somewhere inert, somewhere sealed, empty, dead, far from water and people, a void that could hold the contents forever and never leak them anywhere that mattered. And I had spent all night mapping the hill. There was a void. Deep, deeper than this chamber on the far side of the hill from the flats, a natural cavity in the bedrock, dry, sealed, with no channel to the spring or the groundwater or the sea, a dead pocket of nothing in the heart of the stone. I'd felt it in the dark, hours ago, and dismissed it as irrelevant. It was not irrelevant. It was the answer. A place to put the poison where it could sit, harmless, for 1,000 years. The problem was the moving. I could not carry the ochre force. I could not open the vessel and pour it. Opening it was the catastrophe, but I could teleport. And I'd learned, in the storm, how to teleport diffuse things, water, liquid, the stubborn, slippery mass of it. I'd drained a flooded hold that way, load after load, until I nearly blacked out. This was the same problem, harder. Teleport the contents of the vessel in controlled amounts through its own walls, directly into the dead void deep in the hill, never opening it, never touching the cracks, drawing the pressure down a fraction at a time, load after careful load, until the vessel was empty and inert and the leak simply stopped because there was nothing left to leak. A shunt, not a battle, a drain. The exact opposite of what every mage in the province would have done. Iruka, I said, I need you to go back out. Now. I'm not leaving you in. You are, because if this goes wrong, I need someone alive at the mouth who can tell Tadakatsu what happened and get everyone off this coast before the water turns. And because, I made myself say it plainly, because if I lose control of the pressure while I'm draining it, this chamber is where it vents first, and I want exactly one person in it. Me. Go hold the still with Genba. If I don't come out by the time the lantern's half gone, you seal Shiohama and you sail. I met his young enchanted eyes. You wanted to learn things, Iruka. Learn this one. The person who does the dangerous work does it with as few people in the room as possible. Go. He went. He hated it, and he went, because he was young, but he wasn't a fool, and a tracker understands that you don't crowd the man diffusing the trap. Then I was alone in the dead old chamber with the leaking vessel, and I reached out, and I began. It took me the whole of that lantern, and most of the strength I had. I'll tell you what it was like, because I'll never be able to explain it to anyone who wasn't in that hill. I reached into the vessel with the spatial sense through the walls, past the cracks, into the pressurized reservoir of ochre force, and I found the smallest amount of it I could grip, a controlled mass, no more than my sense could hold cleanly, and I skipped it. Out of the vessel, through solid rock, into the dead void deep in the hill, no crossing the distance between, no opening, no contact. The poison simply was in the vessel and then was in the void, and the pressure inside the vessel dropped by a hair, and the crack stopped weeping for one held breath. Then I did it again, and again, and again. Load after careful load, and it was the hardest and most precise magic I had ever done. Because the force fought the sense the way seawater fought it in the storm, slippery and diffuse and alive feeling in a way that made my skin crawl. And if I gripped too much, I'd lose control of it mid-skip and vent it into the chamber around me. And if I gripped too little, I'd be here for days I didn't have. I had to hold the exact edge of my capacity, load after load, in poisoned air, in the dark, draining a dead civilization's broken bomb one careful skip at a time into the belly of a hill. And this is where I did the thing I'd learned in a crib and unlearned nowhere. I did not drain the pool to the bottom. Going to zero would have dropped me like a snuffed candle, the way one pebble dropped me my first night alive, the way the storm dropped me the moment the ship was safe and unconscious in that chamber. I'd wake, if I woke at all, to a half-drained vessel more dangerous than a full one. So I worked the edge instead of the bottom. Skip a load. Stop. Wait. Hunched in the dark until the thin trickle of returning strength refilled just enough for one more. Skip again. It was maddeningly slow, and it was the only way to do it and stay conscious, and it turned an afternoon's work into most of a day. Between the loads I drank from Genba's flask, because a body sweating in poisoned heat for hours needs water more than it needs anything, and because I could hear my father in my head saying a good quartermaster wins the war by remembering the small things. And every few dozen loads, when the taint in the close air got thick enough to swim in my head, I crawled back up the fissure toward the mouth, toward the draft, toward the pull of clean air the breathing hill still gave, and I put my face in the moving air and breathed until my thoughts came back straight. And then I crawled down and skipped again. The gray came for me anyway, in the long middle of it, the way it always did when I pushed the pool, but it came at the edge and stayed at the edge, held there by the pauses and the water and the crawls to the air, never quite closing over, because I would not let it. This was the empty the pool method I'd invented in a crib, except now I was writing it deliberately, hour after hour, running on the pauses and the flask and the sheer refusal of the man who'd once done 6 spreadsheets in a meeting and the boy who couldn't look away from a village the size of home. Load, wait, water, load, air, load, the ochre light in the cracks getting, load by load, a little dimmer. I did not stop. I could not stop. A half-drained vessel is more dangerous than a full one. Its pressure uneven, its cracks stressed, and I understood that once I'd started I was committed to finishing or dying, that there was no safe place to quit halfway. So I held the rhythm past exhaustion, into a place I'd never taken myself, and the light dimmed, and the pressure dropped, and the weeping cracks went dry. And then, at the very edge of the lantern and the very edge of myself, the vessel was empty. The ochre light in the cracks guttered and went out. The seeping stopped. The vast wrong pressure I'd been feeling for hours was simply gone, drained down into a dead void deep in the hill where it would sit, sealed and harmless, longer than any name I knew would last. The vessel sat on its dais, cracked and dark, and finally, completely inert, not destroyed, not fought, not shattered, just emptied, relieved. A broken thing made safe by taking away the pressure that made it dangerous, instead of by hitting it. Even the wrong heat was fading, and with it, I knew, the breathing of the hill would fade too. I got out of the hill. I honestly don't remember most of the crawl. I remember the ochre stink fading, and the draft weakening as the chamber cooled behind me, and light, real daylight, and Genba's enormous hands pulling me the last body length out of the fissure with a tenderness that terrifying strength should not have been capable of, and Iruka's face, and Mort's. And then I remember sitting in the sea wind on the slope above Shiohama, wrung out past anything I'd ever felt, the empty flask still in my fist, watching the spring below us. The spring ran clear. Not all at once. The poison already in the groundwater would take time to flush, months maybe. The ponds would heal slow. But the spring at the foot of the hill, the one that had run warm and ochre and wrong, ran cold and clear and sweet, the way it had for centuries before an old vessel cracked, because there was nothing left in the hill to foul it. The leak had stopped, not been fought, stopped. Tadakatsu came down to Shiohama himself when the word reached him, which a governor does not do, and he stood on the slope with his robed mages behind him and looked at the clear spring and then at the 11-year-old boy sitting exhausted in the sea wind. And his mages had no idea what to say, because they had spent 2 years fighting a curse, and a foreign child had ended it in an afternoon by refusing to fight anything at all. "You went into the hill," Tadakatsu said, quietly. "You found the thing my mages could not find, and you did not destroy it." His eyes moved to the clear spring, to the fishing village that would live now to me. My mages tell me now, after that if the source had been struck, it would have released everything at once. That destroying it would have killed Shiohama and poisoned the coast. They tell me this now, as though they knew it all along. A dry, terrible weight in his voice, the voice of a ruler contemplating how close his own protectors had come to committing a massacre out of instinct. You knew it before. You knew not to fight the thing that could not be fought. How? I was too tired to be careful, and I'd stopped being careful anyway, weeks ago, on a dock that smelled of home. Because a thing that spreads isn't always an enemy, I said. Sometimes it's just a system that's broken, and you don't fix a broken system by hitting it. You figure out how it works, and you give it somewhere else to go. I looked up at the most powerful man I'd ever face, and I didn't feel small. Your mages are brave men, Governor. Bravery was the wrong tool. That's all. It's the wrong tool more often than anyone with a sword wants to admit. Behind Tadakatsu, his mages shifted, and I saw the specific face I'd seen on Horn and Vance and my grandmother, the face of the certain proven wrong. But Tadakatsu didn't share it. He was looking at me the way Kesk had looked at the impossible Stow, the way my father had looked across the reversey board, the way everyone eventually looked. And I understood, sitting there emptied on the slope, that I had just done a thing no guild in Yamato could conceive that I had, for the first time in either life, stopped being the underestimated boy and become, plainly and undeniably, the most capable person on that coast. The dominance the plan had been climbing toward my whole life had arrived, and it hadn't looked like power at all. It had looked like a boy too stubborn to hit a broken thing, draining a bomb one careful skip at a time in the dark, pausing for air and water like any tired workman because a village down the slope was the size and shape of home. Tadakatsu was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Come back to my seat when you've rested, Reido Midorikawa. I find I have something to offer you." I already knew what it would be, and I already knew what I'd say. I rested a week, because emptying 11 years of mana into a broken artifact is not a thing you walk off in a day. And then I went back up the river valley to Tadakatsu's seat, and he offered me a province. Not in those words, but that was the shape of it, and everyone in the room understood the shape. He received me again in the room open to the garden, the mountain framed in the doorway, and this time his mages were not behind him. This was between the governor and the boy, and he laid it out with the directness of a man who'd decided I'd earned directness. "You saved Shiohama," he said. "You saw what 2 years of my mages could not see, and you did what none of them could do, and you did it without asking for anything. That is rare, rarer than your magic." He set down his tea. "I administer this province for a distant capital, and a province is a hungry thing. It always needs more capable men, and it never has enough. I am offering you a place in it, a title. Land good land, a district of your own on this coast, with the standing and the income that comes with it. You would be a lord of Yamato, Reido Midorikawa, a made man in a rich and ancient country at 11 years old." His eyes held mine. "Most men would sail home rich merchants. I am offering you the chance to sail home a nobody, and stay here as somebody. You understand the difference." I watched you understand every difference I've put in front of you. The room was very still. Behind me, I felt Yuna go rigid. She'd come with me this time, and Genba and Takaido, who I could feel vibrating with the enormity of it, because a title in Yamato meant a permanent foothold, meant the silver wind and the Midorikawa name planted forever in the richest closed market at the edge of the world, meant a fortune beyond anything we'd imagined when we loaded soy sauce onto a fat-bellied ship. Takaido wanted me to take it. I could feel him wanting it from across the room. And here is the thing I want to be honest about, because I promised honesty at the very start, dying under a truck. For one long breath, I was tempted. Not by the power. I'd never wanted power, not in either life. I was tempted because a title in Yamato meant I could live here, in the land that smelled of home. Among the tatami and the soy sauce and the mountains and the roofs that reached into the oldest part of me. The salaryman had died wishing to go home to a village, and I was standing in a country that was that village made into a whole world, being offered the chance to stay in it forever, and for one breath the ghost in me leaned toward it so hard I almost couldn't feel my feet. Then I thought about the porch in Kohara. I thought about the wind in the wheat fields, and Momo's cooking disasters, and Dantaro's sideways stories, and Tetsuo teaching me letters I already knew because it was how he said he loved me. I thought about my father putting his big scarred hand flat on the reversey board and telling me a quiet house with nobody in it isn't peace. It's just quiet, that the thing worth having was the crowd of people you'd let the world notice you for. I thought about my mother, who'd been sick a long time and gone quiet all the way when I was 5, and how my father still kept her in the careful, slow way he set out the pale reversey stones. Her manner, that none of us ever remarked on because some griefs you honor by leaving them alone. I thought about how Yamato smelled like home but wasn't home, because home had never been the place. Home was the people. The salaryman had gotten that exactly backwards his whole short life, chasing a village when what he'd wanted was a family, and he'd died before he learned the difference, and I'd been handed a second life to learn it in, and I had learned it, at a hearth, at 7 years old, and I was not going to unlearn it now for the smell of soy sauce. No, I said. Takahiro made a small strangled sound behind me. Tadakatsu did not move. I'm honored, Governor, truly. It's the greatest thing anyone's ever offered me, and I want you to know I understand exactly how great it is. I met his eyes and I gave him the truth, the whole of it, because he'd earned the whole of it. But I don't want to be important. I never have. I helped Shiohama because it was the size and shape of my home, and I couldn't look away, not because I wanted a district of my own. And if I take your title, I stay here as somebody, like you said, a lord, and I lose the thing I actually want, which is a porch and a wheat field and a house full of people who lie kindly to each other about the important things. That's home. It's across the sea, in the mud, and it's waiting for me. And no amount of good land on this coast is worth more than the people already waiting on that porch. I bowed to him, the deep bow, the correct one, the one that was courtesy and not mockery. I'd rather be a nobody who goes home than a somebody who doesn't. There was a long silence in the room open to the garden. And then Governor Tadakatsu, dignified, powerful, a man who administered a province and had surely never in his life had a gift like that refused, did a thing I hadn't predicted, which is a rare enough event that I remember it perfectly. He laughed, not cruelly, not in disbelief. He laughed the way my father laughed, the cracked, surprised laugh of a man delighted by something he didn't see coming, and he shook his head, and he said, I have offered that reward to a dozen ambitious men over the years, and every one of them took it before I'd finished the sentence. You are the first person to refuse me, and you are 11, and you refused me to go home to a porch. He wiped his eye. The gods are strange. They send us a boy who can do what no mage in the province can do, and the one thing he wants is the one thing he already has. Yes, I said. That's exactly it, Governor. I already have it. I just had to cross an ocean to figure that out. I asked him for two things instead, because a man who refuses a province is a man in an excellent position to ask for small things, and I'd known that going in the strongest negotiating position in the world is wanting less than the other person expects. The first was the soy sauce. The real Yamato method, the root of the thing I'd been reconstructing from memory in a mud village for years, the exact process, the exact cultures, permission to take the craft home and make it properly in Kohara. It was a trivial thing to a governor and a treasure to me, and he granted it the way you grant a small kindness to someone who's just refused you a fortune, with something like relief at finding a request he could actually fulfill. The second was the trade line, not a district, not a title, a charter. A standing agreement between the province of Yamato and the barony of Kohara, the right to run a permanent trade route across the sea, the Silver Wind and any ships that followed it, carrying the games and the mainland goods east and the soy sauce and rice and Yamato craft west under the governor's protection at fair and fixed terms. It made my family a minor rural mud barony at the far edge of a fantasy kingdom, the official cross-sea trade partners of an entire foreign province. Takahiro nearly wept. This was more than the title. In a way that only a merchant could fully feel, a title was one man's foothold, but a charter was a river, a permanent flow of the richest trade on earth, running forever through Kohara, benefiting the whole village and the whole company and generations who'd come after. I'd refused to be a lord and instead made my mud village the gateway between two worlds. Tadakatsu understood exactly what I'd done. I saw him understand it, saw him recognize that the boy who wanted a porch had, almost as an afterthought, negotiated the single most valuable thing a foreigner had ever gotten out of Yamato, and he granted that too, because he'd decided he liked me, and because it cost him little and bound a useful and honest partner to his coast forever. You refuse a district, he said, signing the charter with his own hand, and you take a river. I begin to see how a mud barony grew rich enough to sail here in the first place. He looked up. There was never any question of running your barony from a distance by a child, was there? The rumors in your own capital. It was always true. It was never true, I said, and it was always true. My father runs the barony. I just notice things and tell the people I love about them and let them decide. I smiled. It's the same trick every time, Governor. I've been running it since I was 3. And what? Tadakatsu asked, genuinely curious now. Is the trick? Find the person who could have the idea, I said. Make the idea irresistible. Give them the credit before they've finished having it. Then go home and take a nap. I bowed. You wanted to give the credit for Shiohama to your mages at first. I let you try. It's a good instinct. It's just that this time the idea was mine, and I was too tired to be quiet about it. He laughed again, and that was how I left the seat of the governor of Yamato, with a soy sauce recipe, a river of trade, and a powerful man's real and lasting goodwill, having refused to become a great man and thereby become a far more useful one. We sailed home by the new route, which was the whole point of a charter. Kesk plotted it with the confidence of a master who now had a reason to run this water twice a year for the rest of his life, and the voyage back was easier than the voyage out, because we knew the sea now, and because I'd grown, on the far side of the world, into something I understood. The crossing gave me time, and I spent it on the deck in the sun, doing the thing I'd learned to do at a hearth, taking the measure of the whole system, start to end. I thought about the ledger of my second life the way I'd once thought about a spoiled cellar. Was a lump of nearly manaless flesh in a crib, teleporting a single pebble 30 centimeters and blacking out. Is a boy who drained an ancient artifact bomb into the belly of a mountain and lived. Was a poor mud barony with a spoiled cellar and a father who couldn't sleep. Is the cross-sea trade partner of an entire foreign province, a river of the richest goods on earth running forever through a village of 500 souls. Was a lonely dead salaryman who wished, at the last second under a truck, to go home to a village. Is a boy going home to a porch full of people who'd notice he was gone. The whole arc of it, laid clean like a reversey board, played out to the last stone. I'd started slower and smaller and weaker than the world around me, and I'd won every fight not by being strong but by being patient and seeing the system, the cellar, the well, the game, the road, Vance, Horn, the storm, the salt, and somewhere across the 11 years the fights had climbed, from a wet corner in a cellar to a broken civilization's bomb, and the boy fighting them had climbed with them, from a baby who couldn't lift a spoon to a person a governor offered a province. I was now, plainly, the most capable figure in a network that spanned a sea. I could have taken titles in 2 nations. I could have ruled, if ruling was a thing I'd ever wanted. And I was sailing home to take a nap on a porch, because I'd finally, fully, in my bones, understood the thing my father had told me, and the thing the clerk had tried to warn me about in a white room a whole death ago. Quiet's harder to keep than people think. He'd been right, and I'd spent 11 years learning why. Not because the world drags you into adventure, though it does. Because the quiet I'd wanted, the empty, invisible nobody's life, was never actually the thing I wanted at all. It was the shape my grief had taken, dying exhausted and unloved under a truck. What I'd actually wanted, underneath, was the opposite of the office, not silence, but people who lied kindly about the important things. Not invisibility, but a place where being gone would be noticed. I'd chased quiet because I'd confused it with home, the way the salaryman confused a village with a family, and it had taken a spoiled cellar, and a reversey board, and a scheming noble, and a killing storm, and a poisoned hill, and a governor's refused province to teach me the difference. I wasn't a nobody. I was never going to be a nobody. I'd stopped wanting to be, on a dock that smelled of soy sauce, watching Yuna find her whole life's hunger fed on a foreign practice ground, watching Genba conquer chopsticks, watching Iruka go wide-eyed at a nail-less joint. I was somebody, undeniably, to a whole coast that would tell the story of the foreign boy who saved Shiohama for 100 years. But I was going home to be nobody in the only place it had ever meant anything, nobody special. Just Rado, the second son, the clever lazy one, the one who noticed things and told the people he loved about them and let them take the credit and went and took a nap. That kind of nobody, the kind you only get to be among people who already know exactly who you are. Yuna found me at the rail on the last day of the crossing, the mainland coast a green line ahead of us under the afternoon sun. She stood beside me a while in silence, a warrior now, a real one, sun-browned and easy in her strength in a way the frustrated 12-year-old behind the soy shed could never have imagined. "You could have been a lord," she said finally. "In Yamato, Takairo's still not over it. He keeps doing sums in his sleep about what you turned down. I know. Why didn't you?" She wasn't accusing. She was asking the way Tadakatsu had asked, the way my grandmother had asked, the way everyone eventually asked. "You've spent your whole life pretending to be less than you are. You could have stopped. You could have been the biggest man in a country, and you asked for a soy sauce recipe." I looked at the green line of home coming up out of the sea, and I thought about a porch and a wheat field and a hearth and a game where the stones turn. "Because I already tried being important," I said. "In another life you don't know about. It killed me." I watched the coast rise. This time I'd rather come home. Yuna didn't understand the first part, and she didn't ask because she'd spent 11 years learning not to ask about the parts of me that didn't add up. She just leaned on the rail beside me, her shoulder against mine. My strange, clever brother she'd caught once with a floating spoon and covered for with a diagram in the dirt years later. And we watched the mainland come, together, and the wind smelled of salt and, faintly, impossibly, of the wheat that would be high in the fields of Kohara. Home was 3 days up the good road from the coast. I couldn't wait to take a nap.